The lecture hall was unusually quiet for the first day of the Harvard Horizons program. The anticipation in the air was palpable, as students from Boston's most underprivileged neighborhoods gathered for their chance to experience the world-renowned institution up close. It was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, a rare chance to step into the ivory tower of academia. Yet, amid the excitement, there was something else, an undercurrent of nervousness that clung to the students, especially the young boy standing by the door. Daniel Thompson stood frozen, his hand still on the door handle, trying to steady his breath. He had been running. Not just today, but for years. The weight of his life hung heavy on his small shoulders, the poverty, the exhaustion, the ever-present feeling of being an outsider. Harvard was supposed to be a place where dreams were born, but right now, it felt like a fortress that was slowly closing its gates on him. He glanced at the clock above the blackboard, 9:07 a.m. 7 minutes late. He cursed under his breath, knowing it was a mistake he couldn't afford. In this place, being late meant being less than. Being invisible. "Daniel Thompson," came a voice from the front, sharp and cold. "You're late." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. He looked up and saw the professor standing by the podium, eyes narrowing behind his glasses. Professor Richard Hayes was tall, older, and appeared as immovable as the walls of Harvard itself. His reputation preceded him, demanding, strict, and known for his rigid adherence to punctuality. To Hayes, discipline was everything. And today, it seemed, that discipline was going to cost Daniel. "I'm sorry," Daniel muttered, his voice barely audible. "I tried to get here earlier. I live." "Enough excuses," Hayes cut him off. His voice rang out with an authority that could freeze anyone in their tracks. "This is Harvard. You do not make excuses. You follow the rules. You respect the time. This is the real world, Daniel. The real world does not care about your struggles." Daniel's face flushed, his hands trembling. He had heard the stories about professors like Hayes, demanding, unsympathetic to the struggles of kids like him. But hearing it firsthand, from someone standing in front of him, made the reality all the more painful. He swallowed hard, trying to steady his breath. "Do you understand?" Hayes asked, taking a step forward. The entire class was watching now, eyes wide, unsure of what was about to happen next. Daniel nodded, feeling smaller than he had ever felt in his life. He opened his mouth to speak, to explain, but the words caught in his throat. How could he explain the things that no one could see? The way he had woken up at 4 a.m. to help his mother get his younger brother ready for the day. The way he had walked 4 miles just to catch the bus, then had to run the rest of the way when he missed it. How could he explain the weight of responsibility on his shoulders, the never-ending cycle of trying to stay ahead when everything was pulling him back? "I said, do you understand?" Hayes repeated, his voice now a low, dangerous growl. Daniel's mind raced. The students behind him shifted uncomfortably in their seats, eyes flicking between him and the professor. Some looked sympathetic, but none spoke up. The room was charged with tension. Every second stretched out, dragging like hours. Suddenly, Hayes raised his hand. Without warning, he slapped Daniel across the face. The sound of it echoed throughout the room, sharp and startling, as if the entire building had been struck. The students gasped, some covering their mouths, others frozen in shock. Daniel's head snapped to the side from the force of the slap, his cheek burning with the sting of it. For a brief moment, he was too stunned to react. His hand hovered near his face, but he couldn't bring himself to touch it. He stood there, motionless, as if the slap had knocked all the life out of him. Professor Hayes stood tall, his expression unreadable, like a judge issuing a final sentence. He didn't seem to regret his actions. In fact, he looked more disappointed than anything else. "This is how we learn here," Hayes said coldly, his eyes sweeping across the room. "This is how we grow. Respect for the rules is the foundation of success." The room remained silent. No one moved. No one spoke. Daniel's ears rang, and his heart thudded in his chest. His body was frozen, but inside, he was crumbling. He had never been treated like this before, not even by the kids at school who called him names, not even by his own classmates who looked down on him for being from a poor neighborhood. But this was different. This was Harvard. This is a place of excellence, Hayes continued, now addressing the rest of the class. And if you can't handle that, then perhaps you don't belong here. Daniel's legs felt weak, like they might give out any second. He could feel the eyes of the class on him, but he didn't dare meet their gazes. Instead, he quietly moved to an empty seat at the back of the room, his shoulders hunched as if he could somehow shrink away from the shame. He wanted to vanish, to disappear into the fabric of his old, worn-out clothes. But the more he tried to fade into the background, the more the weight of the slap pressed down on him. Professor Hayes went back to his lecture as if nothing had happened, continuing to speak about economics with the same detached precision. But Daniel couldn't concentrate. He couldn't focus on the words. He couldn't even hear them. All he could hear was the ringing in his ears and the thudding of his heart in his chest. He wasn't sure how long he sat there in silence, his face burning with embarrassment. The lesson felt like a blur, the faces of the students around him seemed distant, like he was watching through a foggy window. When the class ended, Daniel didn't wait around. He grabbed his backpack, stuffed his notes inside, and rushed out of the room without looking back. As soon as the door closed behind him, the cool air of the Harvard campus hit him like a wave, but it didn't bring him relief. Instead, it made him feel more out of place than ever. Like a visitor in a world that wasn't meant for him. Outside, he stopped for a moment, taking in the sprawling beauty of the campus, the manicured lawns, the historic buildings, the students chatting and laughing as if everything were perfect. It was all so far removed from his reality. From his life. His mother working 2 jobs just to put food on the table, the miles he walked every day just to get to this place, the feeling of being constantly behind, always fighting for a chance that might never come. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't. And yet, something inside him refused to let go of the dream. He clenched his fists, taking a deep breath. No matter how hard it was, he wouldn't quit. He couldn't. Because maybe, just maybe, this was the only chance he'd ever get. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Daniel didn't come back the next day. It wasn't that he had made a conscious decision to quit, he didn't feel like he had the luxury of choice. The slap, the way it rang through his head like a cruel, hollow echo, stayed with him all night. When he closed his eyes, it wasn't the professor's harsh words that haunted him, but the sting of that slap, burning deep into his skin. The way it made him feel small. Less than. Unworthy. And yet, something inside him still ached to be there. Harvard, with its towering buildings and grand history, was a dream he could never fully relinquish. The chance to prove himself. To escape the limitations of his life. But was it even possible now? The next morning, as his alarm rang at 5:30 a.m. Daniel rolled over in bed, staring up at the ceiling, unsure of what to do. He could hear Micah stirring in the bunk bed above him, the soft shuffle of his feet as he began his day. Their mother would be out again, scrubbing office floors, trying to make enough to pay the rent and keep food on the table. They had learned to live without her a lot of the time. Daniel slowly pulled himself from bed and began his morning routine. He didn't have much time to think about what had happened yesterday. There were too many other things on his plate, things that didn't go away just because a Harvard professor had slapped him. At 7:30 a.m., he was out the door. Micah was already eating cereal in front of the TV, oblivious to his brother's inner turmoil. Daniel slipped out quietly, hoping his mother wouldn't notice he wasn't going to class. But she was at work already, and he hadn't had the courage to tell her about what happened. His shoes, already worn and frayed, slapped against the pavement as he made his way down the familiar streets. The walk felt longer today, the weight on his shoulders heavier than before. Was this what it felt like to be defeated? He took the usual shortcut through the alley to the bus stop, but his mind kept racing. What would he tell the others? What would he say to Professor Hayes if he saw him again? Would the professor even care? By the time he reached the bus stop, Daniel's hands were shaking. He dug his nails into his palms, trying to calm himself, but it didn't help. He could still hear the slap, still feel the sting. As he stood waiting for the bus, Daniel spotted Caleb Whitman across the street. Caleb, one of the other students from the program, was leaning against a lamppost, a Starbucks cup in his hand, looking out at the passing cars. Caleb's crisp, white shirt contrasted sharply against Daniel's faded hoodie. His designer jeans and shiny shoes were so out of place in their neighborhood, a stark reminder of the gap that separated them. Caleb saw Daniel and waved, walking over. "Hey," Caleb said, his voice casual. "You coming to class today?" Daniel hesitated. No. I don't think I'm gonna make it." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" Daniel shifted uneasily. He didn't want to tell Caleb about what happened. He didn't want to explain why he felt like a failure. I don't feel like it." Caleb frowned. "You okay?" "I'm fine," Daniel lied, but the words felt heavy on his tongue. "All right," Caleb said, still looking at him with concern. "But, hey, the class is kind of weird without you. We all saw what happened yesterday, you know. Everyone's talking about it." Daniel stiffened, his stomach knotting. "What are they saying?" "Some people are on your side," Caleb said quietly, looking around to make sure no one was listening. "Others, well, they think the professor had a point. But I get it, man. That was messed up." Daniel didn't know what to say. He felt trapped between the worlds of the students in the outreach program and the world of the wealthy, entitled kids like Caleb, who had their whole lives mapped out for them. He didn't belong in either place. Before he could respond, the bus pulled up, its brakes screeching as it came to a stop. Caleb waved goodbye and climbed aboard. Daniel stood there for a moment longer, watching the bus drive off, before turning and walking back down the street, away from the station. The rest of the day passed in a haze. Daniel stayed home, not sure what else to do with himself. The thoughts of Harvard, of the slap, of the overwhelming desire to fit in, all swirled around in his mind like a storm. There was no escaping it. He knew he couldn't just walk away from the opportunity that had been given to him. At 3 p.m., Daniel was sitting in the kitchen when his phone buzzed. It was a message from Caleb. "You sure you're not coming back? People are talking. I told them you were just overwhelmed, but I think we all need to stand together. I don't want you to feel like you're alone in this." Daniel stared at the screen for a moment, the words sinking in. Caleb didn't understand. None of them did. They were from different worlds. They couldn't know what it was like to fight every day, to scrape by and still feel like it wasn't enough. Still, Daniel couldn't shake the thought that maybe Caleb was right. Maybe he didn't have to fight alone. Maybe he could return. Maybe, if he had the courage, he could face Hayes again. Maybe he could find a way to prove himself. To show that he was more than what people assumed. Daniel stood up, his heart racing. It was a small step. But it was something. He could go back. He had to go back. But as he walked towards the door, a feeling of dread washed over him. Would things be different this time? Would Professor Hayes see him as more than just a late, unworthy kid? Or was he forever marked by that slap? He took a deep breath, opened the door, and stepped out into the street. At the same time, in the stark, well-lit office of Professor Hayes, the older man sat staring at his computer screen. The video of the incident from the previous day was playing on a loop, his face drawn tight in thought. His sharp eyes scanned the footage, replaying the moment again and again. The slap. The boy's face. The stunned silence. Hayes was a man of principles, someone who believed that discipline was the key to success. But as he watched Daniel's face, something gnawed at him. Something didn't sit right. He had made a mistake. He had done something he couldn't take back. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. Should he apologize? Should he reach out to Daniel? But Hayes wasn't sure how to fix this. He didn't know how to undo what had been done. The stage was set for the next confrontation. Daniel, still unsure of where he belonged, and Hayes, a man whose principles had just been shaken, were both at a crossroads. They were connected now, in ways neither of them fully understood. Daniel's journey had just begun, and in his heart, he knew the fight wasn't over. Not yet. The next morning, Daniel woke up earlier than usual. The sun had barely risen, and the air was still thick with the heavy fog that often blanketed the streets of his neighborhood. He had hardly slept, his mind swirling with thoughts of Harvard, the slap, and everything that had happened since. But today felt different. Today, he was going to go back. It wasn't about the class or the professor anymore. It wasn't even about proving to anyone that he belonged. No, this was about something deeper. Something he couldn't quite put into words. It was about facing his own fear. About standing up in the face of failure and shame, no matter how overwhelming the odds seemed. He spent a few extra minutes getting ready. His clothes were the same, old jeans and a hoodie, but this time, he made sure to straighten the collar and wipe the dirt from his sneakers. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He had to give himself a chance. The bus ride into the city was quieter than usual. Daniel sat by the window, watching the world go by, feeling every bump in the road. His stomach twisted with nerves, but he kept his focus on the street signs passing by, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in his chest. He had to go. There was no turning back now. By the time he arrived at Harvard, the campus was already bustling with students. They moved in packs, laughing in groups, talking about their plans for the day. It was as if nothing had changed, as if everything was exactly the way it had been the day before. But Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The way people glanced at him as he walked by, some with curiosity, others with pity, it was as if they all knew what had happened. He didn't belong here. Not really. He paused in front of the lecture hall, looking up at the imposing building. The doors were open, but he hesitated before stepping inside. It felt like walking into the lion's den. He wasn't sure if he was strong enough to face Professor Hayes again, let alone sit through another class under the man's unforgiving gaze. But the door was open. And with one final, steadying breath, Daniel stepped inside. The room was already filling with students, their chatter light and carefree as they took their seats. Daniel found an empty spot near the back of the room and sat down quickly, keeping his head low, trying to blend into the shadows. He didn't want to draw attention to himself. He didn't want anyone to know that he had come back. But no matter how hard he tried to remain unnoticed, he could feel the eyes on him. His heart pounded in his chest as he clutched the strap of his backpack tightly. He couldn't help it, he felt like an outsider, someone who had been let in by mistake. Moments later, Professor Hayes walked into the room, his sharp eyes scanning the class before settling on the podium. He didn't look at Daniel, at least not directly, but there was a tension in the air that didn't escape him. Daniel could feel it, Hayes was watching him. As the professor began the lecture, Daniel's mind kept drifting. It wasn't the economics that held his attention. It was the man at the front of the room. Hayes was speaking about the global economy, the impact of markets on poverty, and the intricacies of financial systems. But Daniel couldn't focus. All he could think about was how the professor had treated him yesterday. How one moment of anger had felt like the death of a dream. He knew that he had to prove himself now. He had to show that he wasn't the sum of one mistake. That he was more than the kid who had been late, the kid who had been slapped. The rest of the class went by in a blur. Daniel tried to keep his head down, scribbling notes, but he was acutely aware of every sound, every movement around him. The murmurs of the students, the way their eyes shifted to him when they thought he wasn't looking, the way the professor's voice seemed to grow colder with every passing moment. At one point, Hayes stopped speaking mid-sentence, his eyes flicking over the students before settling on Daniel. The room fell silent, and for a moment, Daniel felt his heart stop. "Mr. Thompson," Hayes said, his voice sharp as a whip. "Would you care to explain the economic concept I just mentioned? You seem to be distracted today." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't been paying attention, but he knew he couldn't admit that. His mind raced, scrambling for something to say. I believe you were talking about the effects of supply and demand on market fluctuations," Daniel said, his voice steady despite the panic rising in his chest. Hayes gave him a long look, his lips tightening. He didn't acknowledge the answer right away, but Daniel could see something in his eyes. A flicker of doubt. Maybe even something like respect. "Correct," Hayes said after a beat, his voice softening just slightly. "But I expect more than just passing knowledge. You should be engaged, Mr. Thompson. I'll be watching." The words stung, but they weren't as harsh as before. Something had changed. Daniel didn't know what it was, but for the first time since he stepped into this room, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't completely invisible. The rest of the class passed uneventfully. Daniel kept his head down, focusing on the lecture, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just crossed an invisible line. He had survived the moment. He had faced his fear. When the bell finally rang, signaling the end of class, Daniel packed up his things quickly and stood up to leave. As he made his way toward the door, he felt someone tap him on the shoulder. He turned to see Caleb standing behind him, a small smile on his face. "Hey," Caleb said, "I'm glad you came back. I know it's not easy. But you did it." Daniel nodded, grateful for the kind words, but still unsure how to respond. "Yeah. I guess I did." "Good luck," Caleb said, giving him a thumbs up before walking away. Daniel lingered in the doorway for a moment, watching as the other students filed out of the room. He felt a strange sense of accomplishment, as if he had passed some kind of test. But there was still so much left to prove. As he walked down the hallway, his footsteps echoing in the quiet corridor, Daniel felt a flicker of hope. He wasn't done yet. He wasn't giving up. He wasn't just a boy from the wrong side of the tracks. He was here, and he was going to stay. The next few days passed in a blur. Daniel showed up to every class, sitting quietly in the back, trying to make himself as invisible as possible. He wasn't sure what he was trying to prove anymore, whether it was to Professor Hayes or to himself. All he knew was that he couldn't give up. No matter how hard it got, no matter how much the world seemed to push back against him, he had to keep going. Every time Daniel stepped into the lecture hall, he felt the weight of the room bearing down on him. The eyes of the other students were often on him, whispering behind their hands, speculating. It was clear that his arrival had shaken things up, and some of them, especially the wealthier students, looked at him like he didn't belong there. But the biggest weight of all was the silent presence of Professor Hayes, whose cold gaze still seemed to cut through him with every glance. But today, something felt different. It was another Tuesday morning. Daniel had come in early to get a seat before the room filled up. He sat near the back, as usual, keeping his head low. The room gradually filled with students, but Daniel didn't pay much attention to them. His thoughts were elsewhere, drifting back to the moment in class when he had answered Hayes's question correctly. The subtle shift in the professor's attitude had not gone unnoticed by him. That brief moment of acknowledgement, that flicker of respect, he had to hold on to that. But even with that small victory, there was still a question that gnawed at him. Was it enough? Was one answer, one moment of bravery, enough to change how Professor Hayes saw him? Or was he still just that kid who had been slapped, the one who had made a fool of himself? He didn't have much time to dwell on it before the door at the front of the room swung open, and Professor Hayes strode in, his sharp eyes scanning the room. Daniel couldn't help but notice that the professor's presence seemed even more imposing today, his posture rigid, his gaze colder than usual. "Good morning, class," Hayes said, his voice cutting through the air with authority. "Today, we will be discussing global trade policies and their effects on emerging markets." Daniel's pulse quickened. Trade policies. Emerging markets. The material was difficult, but it wasn't impossible to grasp. He had been studying the subject relentlessly, trying to keep up with the pace of the class, but every time the professor spoke, it felt like he was drowning in a sea of terms and theories that didn't quite make sense to him. The lecture continued, but Daniel's focus began to drift. He found himself staring at the clock, watching each tick of the second hand, wishing for the class to end so he could escape the pressure. He tried to take notes, but the words on the page seemed to blur together. Nothing felt real except for the way Hayes's voice echoed in his mind. Suddenly, the professor's voice broke through his reverie. "Mr. Thompson," Hayes said, his voice sharp and commanding. "Could you explain to the class the significance of the trade imbalance between the US and China and its impact on the global market?" The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Daniel. His stomach twisted in knots, and for a moment, he froze. Was Hayes setting him up to fail? Was this his way of testing him again, waiting for him to stumble? But then, Daniel did something he hadn't done before. He took a deep breath. He cleared his throat, straightened his back, and raised his hand. I believe the trade imbalance between the US and China is a significant issue because it affects the flow of goods and services between the two countries, Daniel began, his voice shaky at first, but growing stronger with each word. The US imports more from China than it exports, which creates a deficit. This imbalance can have widespread effects on the global economy, especially in terms of inflation, currency fluctuations, and employment in various industries. Daniel paused, his heart racing. He had said it. He had actually said something. Hayes, who had been standing at the front of the room with his arms crossed, raised an eyebrow. There was no sign of approval, but there was something in his eyes, something that wasn't contempt, something that looked like a trace of curiosity. "Go on," Hayes said, his voice soft but insistent. Well, when there's a trade deficit, it puts pressure on domestic industries, especially manufacturing jobs in the US, Daniel continued. And if the US continues to rely heavily on Chinese imports, it could also impact the dollar's value and create trade wars that affect other countries' economies. The room was completely still as Daniel spoke. His voice was growing more confident now, his thoughts coming together in a way he hadn't expected. He could feel the weight of the professor's gaze, but it didn't feel quite as suffocating as it had before. When he finished, he lowered his head, waiting for Hayes's judgment. Professor Hayes took a long moment before responding. His expression was unreadable. Finally, he spoke. "Not bad, Mr. Thompson. But it's clear you're only scratching the surface of a far more complex issue. You'll need to study this more thoroughly if you want to fully grasp the intricacies of global trade. But I will admit," Hayes paused, his eyes flicking briefly to the rest of the class, "you made a valid point." The words hung in the air like a fragile thread. Valid point. Daniel's chest tightened with a mix of relief and disbelief. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an affirmation of his worth. But it was something. Something that felt like progress. The rest of the class passed in a blur. Daniel could hardly focus after that moment, his mind still processing what had just happened. He hadn't been perfect, but he hadn't been dismissed either. Hayes had acknowledged him, not as a mistake, but as someone worth paying attention to. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. When the bell rang and students began filing out of the room, Daniel stood up, his legs unsteady. He had done it. He had spoken up in front of everyone, in front of Hayes. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't invisible. He was about to leave when he heard a voice behind him. "Hey, Thompson. He turned around to see Hayes standing by the door, his hand on the knob. The professor didn't say anything else, just looked at him with a neutral expression. "I expect you to be ready for the next class," Hayes said, his voice less harsh than before. "Study the material. If you're going to be here, you'll need to catch up." Daniel nodded. "I will, Professor." With that, Hayes stepped out of the room, leaving Daniel standing there, a swirl of emotions churning inside him. He couldn't believe it. It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest thing he had gotten. As he walked out of the lecture hall, Daniel's mind was still racing. He wasn't sure where this road would lead, but for the first time, he felt like he might just be able to walk it. The days that followed felt like an emotional roller coaster for Daniel. Every time he stepped into the lecture hall, there was a quiet expectation hanging in the air. It was subtle, but it was there, an unspoken challenge. Professor Hayes had acknowledged him. He had given him that sliver of validation, that small taste of what it might feel like to belong. But that small victory came with a price. The pressure was mounting. Each class after that moment seemed to be a test, not just of Daniel's academic abilities but of his resilience. He had made it this far, but now he had to prove that he wasn't just a fluke. That he wasn't just the kid who had answered one question correctly out of sheer luck. He had to prove that he could handle the weight of the expectations placed on him, especially with his classmates now looking at him with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. It was Thursday afternoon when things began to feel especially heavy. The lecture on economic inequality was more intense than usual. Hayes was diving into the history of systemic poverty and the role of wealth distribution in shaping society. The material was dense and complex, and for Daniel, it felt like an endless maze of terms and theories he had to navigate just to keep up. But it wasn't the lecture that was eating away at him. It was the way the other students seemed to watch him, furtively glancing at him between their notes and books, their whispers barely audible over the sound of the professor's voice. It was as if he had become some kind of sideshow. Everyone had heard about the incident with Professor Hayes, the slap, the confrontation. They all knew who he was now. And they weren't sure what to make of him. Daniel's stomach churned. He didn't want to be the center of attention. He didn't want to be that kid. But no matter how much he tried to sink into the background, he couldn't escape it. It was as if his presence was a reminder that things weren't supposed to be this way, that a kid like him wasn't supposed to be sitting in a room full of privileged Harvard students. As Hayes continued his lecture, Daniel's mind began to wander, his thoughts drifting back to his life before this. Before Harvard. Back to his mother, the long hours she worked to keep their family afloat, the constant struggle to make ends meet. He remembered the days when they couldn't afford to keep the lights on, when there was barely enough to eat. But there was always hope. His mother had always said that as long as they had each other, they could make it through anything. Now, in this room full of Ivy League students, Daniel felt the weight of that hope crashing down on him. He had fought so hard to get here. He had sacrificed so much. But now that he was in the heart of it all, it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a battle. And the more he tried to win, the harder it seemed to get. Suddenly, the sound of Hayes's voice cut through his thoughts again. "Mr. Thompson," Hayes said, his tone sharp and commanding. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't been paying attention, and now the professor was calling on him. The entire class turned to look at him, their eyes trained on him like a hawk circling its prey. The pressure built, thick and suffocating. I'm sorry, Professor, I didn't catch the question," Daniel managed, his voice barely above a whisper. His face was burning with embarrassment, but he tried to keep his composure. Hayes didn't flinch. His gaze was piercing, unwavering. "You didn't catch the question. Are you not paying attention, Mr. Thompson?" Hayes asked, his voice cutting through the air with a bite. Daniel swallowed hard. "No, Professor. I was just—" "It doesn't matter what you were doing, Mr. Thompson," Hayes interrupted, his voice now colder than ever. "When you're in my class, you focus. If you're not prepared to be here, then leave. There are plenty of students who would take your place in a heartbeat. The words stung more than Daniel could have imagined. The entire class was silent, and he could feel their eyes boring into him, some with judgment, others with curiosity. He didn't belong here. He wasn't good enough. He wasn't smart enough. His mind raced, but his body didn't respond. It was as if his legs had turned to stone, anchoring him to his seat. His throat tightened, and for a moment, it felt like the room was closing in on him. He wanted to run. To hide. But there was no escape from the reality of what was happening. Before Daniel could respond, the bell rang, signaling the end of the lecture. Hayes turned on his heel without a word and walked out of the room, leaving Daniel sitting there, feeling like the weight of the world had just crushed him. As the other students began to file out of the room, Daniel remained seated. He couldn't bring himself to move, couldn't bring himself to face anyone. He had failed again. He had let the pressure get to him. It felt like a mountain he couldn't climb. A few minutes later, Daniel slowly stood up and gathered his things. His hands trembled as he shoved his notebooks into his bag. His heart was pounding, his body aching with exhaustion. He was tired. Tired of trying so hard, tired of feeling like he was always on the verge of breaking. But he wasn't going to break. Not yet. As Daniel walked out of the classroom, he found himself standing in the hallway, surrounded by students. It felt like they were all in a different world, moving with ease through their day, while he was still stuck in his own struggle. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw someone approaching him. It was Caleb. "Hey, man," Caleb said softly, his voice filled with quiet sympathy. "Are you okay?" Daniel wanted to say that he was fine, that he could handle it. But the words wouldn't come. He just nodded, his throat tight. "I'm sorry," Caleb said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Professor Hayes is, well, he's tough. But don't let him get to you. You're not the only one he's hard on." "I know," Daniel said, forcing a smile. "But I'm just tired." Caleb nodded, understanding. "I get it. But listen, you've made it this far. That means something. You're here for a reason, Daniel. Don't forget that." Daniel didn't know what to say to that. He wanted to believe Caleb, but the doubt was still there, gnawing at him. He wasn't sure if he belonged here. But maybe, just maybe, he could make a place for himself. He looked at Caleb, forcing a smile. "Thanks, man. I appreciate it." As Caleb walked away, Daniel stood there for a moment, staring down the hallway. He wasn't sure what his next step would be. But one thing was certain, he wasn't going to give up. Not yet. Not when he had come this far. The battle wasn't over. It was just beginning. The next few days after the incident in class felt like walking through a storm. Daniel tried to keep his head down, but the cloud of tension still hung over him. Every glance from his classmates seemed to weigh on him more than ever. Some of them were sympathetic, but most of them just looked at him with quiet judgment. The whispers behind his back never stopped. And Professor Hayes, despite that one moment of acknowledgement, was colder than ever. But Daniel refused to let it break him. It was Wednesday when he received an unexpected message. It came through the university's student portal, an email from Professor Hayes. His heart skipped a beat when he saw the subject line, "Meeting request, follow-up on recent lecture." He didn't know what to expect. Part of him feared that this was just another chance for Hayes to lecture him, to remind him of how little he belonged. But another part of him felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this was his chance to redeem himself, to prove that he wasn't just some poor kid who had gotten lucky once. Maybe Hayes had seen something in him after all. With a mix of dread and anticipation, Daniel made his way to Hayes's office the next morning. The office was tucked away in one of the quieter corners of the campus, far from the hustle and bustle of the main lecture halls. It felt like a world apart from the chaos of the classroom, and yet, in that moment, it felt like the most important place in the world. Daniel knocked on the door, his palms sweating. He had rehearsed what he was going to say, but now, standing there, words seemed to escape him. "Come in," Hayes's voice called from inside. Daniel took a deep breath and opened the door. The office was just as imposing as the professor himself. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books on economics, history, and politics. There was a large wooden desk in the center, cluttered with papers and a single lamp casting a warm glow over the space. Hayes sat behind the desk, his eyes fixed on a stack of papers. He didn't immediately look up when Daniel entered, which only made the situation feel more uncomfortable. "Have a seat," Hayes said, finally looking up from his papers. His tone was neutral, but there was a strange edge to it. Daniel hesitated for a moment before sitting down. He felt small in that moment, even though the chair was large enough to swallow him whole. His thoughts raced, wondering what this meeting was all about. "Listen, Mr. Thompson," Hayes began, folding his hands on the desk, "I've been thinking about our last class. You didn't perform well, and you know that. But I also see something in you. A spark. Something that tells me you don't belong here by accident." Daniel blinked, surprised by the words. He had expected to hear criticism, to be told he wasn't good enough. But instead, there was something different in Hayes's voice, something almost like respect. "Professor," Daniel started, his voice uncertain, "I know I'm not where I should be. I'm trying, but I don't know if I can keep up with everyone else here. Maybe I don't belong at Harvard." Hayes raised an eyebrow, his gaze sharpening. "That's not the attitude I expect from someone who's been given an opportunity like you've been given. You have the potential to do more than most students here, Mr. Thompson. I didn't put you in this class to see you fail. But you're going to have to fight for it. You'll have to fight harder than everyone else." Daniel's chest tightened as Hayes's words sank in. He had heard this before, his mother's voice in his head, telling him that life would never be easy. That every day was a battle, and if he wanted to make it, he would have to push himself beyond his limits. "Why me, Professor?" Daniel asked quietly. "Why are you giving me a chance?" Hayes leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly on the desk. He seemed to consider Daniel's question for a long moment before responding. "You remind me of someone I once knew," Hayes said softly. "Someone who had to work twice as hard to be taken seriously. Someone who fought for every opportunity, who didn't let the world tell him what he could or couldn't do." Daniel didn't know what to say to that. Hayes's words were unexpected, but there was something in them that resonated deep within him. He could feel the weight of the professor's gaze, but it wasn't the same as before. It wasn't cold. It was understanding. "I've been hard on you, Mr. Thompson," Hayes continued, his voice quieter now. "But I see the potential in you. The question is, do you see it in yourself?" Daniel looked down at his hands, his mind racing. Could he do it? Could he truly rise to the occasion? Or was he just fooling himself, thinking he could change his fate by showing up to class and answering a few questions correctly? "I want to," Daniel said, his voice barely a whisper. "I want to prove that I can do this. That I belong here." Hayes gave a small nod. "Then you'll have to start by proving it to yourself, Mr. Thompson. No one can give you that sense of self-worth. You have to find it within." Daniel felt a knot in his throat, a mix of emotion he couldn't quite describe. It wasn't just about the class or the grades, it was about something deeper. Something about his identity, his place in the world. And for the first time, he wondered if Professor Hayes wasn't just giving him a chance to succeed in academia. Maybe Hayes was giving him a chance to truly believe in himself. "Okay," Daniel said finally, his voice steadying. "I'll do it." Hayes stood up, walking around the desk. He looked down at Daniel for a moment, as if measuring him. Then, without another word, he extended his hand. Daniel stood up, shaking the professor's hand firmly. "I'll hold you to that, Mr. Thompson," Hayes said with a small smile. "Make sure you're ready for the next challenge." As Daniel walked out of the office, his mind was spinning. He had come in expecting a lecture, expecting another failure. But instead, he had been given something more valuable, a chance. A chance to prove himself, not to anyone else, but to himself. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. Daniel knew that. But for the first time since arriving at Harvard, he felt like he might have a real shot. He wasn't sure what the future held, but one thing was certain: he wasn't going to quit. Not now. The days that followed Daniel's meeting with Professor Hayes felt different. For the first time since coming to Harvard, Daniel wasn't weighed down by self-doubt. He wasn't walking through the campus with his head down, trying to avoid being noticed. No. Now, there was a quiet fire within him, a spark that had been lit during that conversation with Hayes. It wasn't just about proving himself in class anymore, it was about proving to himself that he had the strength to push past every obstacle life had thrown at him. The first test came the following Monday. A midterm exam was scheduled for that afternoon in the economics course, and Daniel knew this would be his first real chance to show what he was capable of. He had been studying non-stop for the past few days, poring over his notes late into the night, often with only a few hours of sleep before his early morning classes. The work was hard. The material was complicated. But for the first time, Daniel wasn't overwhelmed. He knew what was at stake. He wasn't just answering questions to pass. He was answering them to prove that he belonged. As the clock ticked down to the start of the exam, Daniel felt his heart begin to race. It wasn't fear this time. It was determination. He had worked for this moment. He had fought for it. And now, he was ready. When the exam papers were handed out, Daniel took a deep breath and opened it up. The questions stared back at him, long, complicated, each one requiring deep thought and analysis. But instead of panicking, Daniel just began to write. The words flowed, the concepts began to connect, and for the first time, he didn't feel out of place in that classroom. The other students around him worked furiously, scribbling down answers, their eyes darting between the pages and their notes. Daniel could hear the low murmurs of frustration from some of them, the occasional rustling of papers as others flipped through their textbooks. But he didn't let it distract him. He was in the zone now, moving through the exam with a steady rhythm. An hour into the exam, Daniel looked up. His eyes wandered around the room, briefly glancing at the other students. Some were staring blankly at their papers, others were hunched over, furiously scribbling, their faces showing signs of stress. But then, his eyes landed on Professor Hayes, who was walking up and down the aisles, his usual stern expression on his face as he observed the class. Hayes's gaze met Daniel's for just a moment, and it was as if time slowed down. There was no judgment in the professor's eyes, no criticism, no disdain. It was something different, something like approval. Like Hayes had seen something in him, too. Something more than just a student who had answered a question correctly. Daniel felt a surge of confidence rush through him, and he turned his attention back to the exam. The last half hour passed in a blur, and before he knew it, the time was up. The exam papers were collected, and Daniel walked out of the classroom feeling a strange sense of calm. He didn't know how he had done on the test. He didn't even care. For the first time, it wasn't about the grade, it was about the effort, the determination, the growth. But the real challenge, Daniel knew, was still to come. The next morning, as he walked to class, his mind was filled with the possibilities of the future. The midterm was behind him now, but there was more work to do. More challenges to face. More battles to win. It wasn't enough just to pass. He had to prove that he could thrive here, that he could take on everything this university demanded and still come out on top. When Daniel entered the lecture hall that day, the usual mix of anticipation and anxiety washed over him. He noticed the familiar faces of his classmates, some of them glancing his way, others absorbed in their conversations. He had grown used to it by now, the way they watched him, wondering if he was really cut out for this place. But he didn't care anymore. He was here for a reason. He had earned his spot, and he wasn't going to let anyone make him feel otherwise. Professor Hayes walked into the room, his eyes scanning over the students. He didn't immediately acknowledge Daniel, but there was something in his posture, a subtle change, that made Daniel feel like his professor was aware of the quiet shift that had occurred. The lecture began, and as the class progressed, Daniel found himself deeply engaged in the discussion. Hayes was presenting a new topic, one that was even more complex than the last. But instead of feeling overwhelmed, Daniel felt something he hadn't felt before, excitement. He wasn't just sitting there passively absorbing information anymore. He was actively participating in the conversation. He was connecting the dots, formulating questions, even offering insights that surprised both himself and the professor. As the class drew to a close, Hayes paused and looked at Daniel. "Mr. Thompson," he said, his voice cutting through the low murmur of the students packing up their things. "You had some interesting points today. Keep that up." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. He had never heard those words from Hayes before, not in that tone. There was something more there now. A level of respect. Recognition. The class emptied out, and Daniel grabbed his bag, heading for the door. He had barely made it halfway out of the room when he felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned around to see Caleb, who had been sitting in the row behind him, waiting for him. "Hey, man," Caleb said with a grin, "you were on fire today. I haven't seen you speak up like that before." Looks like Hayes is starting to take notice. Daniel smiled, but there was a sense of disbelief still lingering in the back of his mind. "Yeah. I don't know. It feels different. Like I'm finally getting it." "You are," Caleb said, slinging an arm around Daniel's shoulders as they walked down the hallway together. "I told you, you've got this. Just keep pushing. Don't let anyone tell you that you don't belong here." Daniel nodded, feeling the weight of those words settle in his chest. For the first time, he truly felt like he was starting to find his place at Harvard. He wasn't just some kid who had slipped through the cracks. He was someone who had fought to be here, and now, he was beginning to show just how much he was capable of. As they stepped outside into the crisp afternoon air, Daniel took a deep breath, looking up at the towering buildings of Harvard. The future still felt uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Daniel was no longer afraid of it. He was ready. The next few weeks at Harvard passed in a blur of lectures, assignments, and late-night study sessions. Daniel's life was no longer just about surviving. He was thriving, and with each passing day, the nagging doubt that had once plagued him seemed to recede further into the background. He was becoming a part of this place, not just a visitor or an outsider, but someone who belonged here, who had earned the right to be here. Professor Hayes had continued to challenge him, and Daniel met each challenge with determination. The papers he handed in were met with approval, and his participation in class discussions became more confident. Hayes's recognition of his potential had sparked something in Daniel, an inner drive that he hadn't realized he possessed. But as the midterm grades started rolling in, Daniel couldn't help but feel the pressure building again. Every grade he received was a reminder that he was still, in many ways, an outsider. The feeling of never being good enough crept back into his mind, and for a brief moment, Daniel was overwhelmed by it. One Tuesday afternoon, after receiving a less-than-ideal grade on his economics midterm, Daniel sat alone on a bench outside one of the lecture halls, staring down at the paper in his hands. His fingers trembled slightly as he turned it over, reading the professor's comments. The grade wasn't terrible, he had passed, but it wasn't the score he had hoped for. The disappointment gnawed at him, and for the first time in a while, he began to question whether he truly had what it took to make it at Harvard. "Are you okay?" Daniel looked up to find Caleb standing in front of him, his expression concerned. Caleb had always been there, ever since the first day Daniel had arrived on campus. The two had quickly become friends, even though Caleb was from a different background, a wealthy family, from a prestigious private school. Despite their differences, Caleb had always treated Daniel as an equal, offering support when Daniel felt isolated. "Yeah," Daniel replied, forcing a smile. Just a rough day." Caleb raised an eyebrow but didn't push further. Instead, he sat down beside Daniel on the bench. "You're allowed to have rough days, you know. Don't let one bad grade make you question everything. I mean, you've been killing it in every other class." Daniel sighed, glancing down at the paper again. "It's not just the grade. It's everything. I'm not like everyone else here. I can't help but feel like I don't belong. Like they're all just waiting for me to mess up." Caleb was quiet for a moment, letting Daniel's words sink in. "Listen," he began, his voice steady but firm, "Harvard's not easy. No one here just sails through without a struggle. But I know you. I've seen how hard you've been working. You've earned your place here, and the fact that you're still going, even when it feels impossible, says everything." Daniel met Caleb's gaze, and for the first time in weeks, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel: gratefulness. Grateful for his friend, for his support, and for the reminder that maybe he wasn't so alone in this after all. "You really think so?" Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know so," Caleb replied. "But you're not going to get anywhere if you keep doubting yourself. You've got to believe you belong here, no matter what anyone else thinks. Including Hayes. Especially Hayes." Daniel frowned. "Professor Hayes? What do you mean?" Caleb chuckled lightly. "I've been watching him, man. And I know that look he gets in his eye when he's impressed. You've got it. But he's not going to hand it to you on a silver platter. He's testing you. Pushing you to see if you'll rise to the challenge." Daniel absorbed Caleb's words. He hadn't realized just how much Hayes had been pushing him, not just with the material but with his expectations. He had been so focused on proving himself to everyone around him that he hadn't stopped to consider that maybe Hayes wasn't just an obstacle. Maybe Hayes was trying to help him become better. But there was still something about that relationship that nagged at him. Every time he looked at Hayes, he felt a mix of admiration and fear. It was like the professor saw something in him that Daniel didn't even know was there. And sometimes, that was a terrifying thought. The next day in class, Daniel tried to push past the doubt. As soon as he walked into the lecture hall, he noticed Hayes already at the front, setting up his notes. The professor's stern expression remained unchanged as he scanned the room, but for the first time, Daniel didn't feel that familiar sense of intimidation. Instead, he felt ready. Ready to face whatever challenge Hayes was about to throw at him. As class started, Hayes dove straight into a complicated new concept, something Daniel hadn't quite grasped yet. But instead of freezing up like he might have done in the past, Daniel raised his hand. "Yes, Mr. Thompson." Hayes's voice was neutral, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something like surprise. Daniel swallowed his nerves and spoke up. "I think I'm following the general idea, but could you explain how this concept ties into the previous lesson? I'm still having trouble seeing the connection." There was a brief pause, and Daniel held his breath, waiting for Hayes's reaction. Would he brush him off? Dismiss him for asking a question he should have already known the answer to? But instead, Hayes nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "That's a very good question, Mr. Thompson. Let me walk you through it," Hayes said, and with that, he launched into a more detailed explanation, breaking down the concept in a way that made sense to Daniel. As the professor spoke, Daniel felt a sense of pride rise in him. It wasn't just about understanding the material, it was about the recognition. Hayes wasn't dismissing him. He wasn't writing him off as just another student who didn't belong. He was engaging with him. He was acknowledging him. When class ended, Daniel lingered for a moment as the other students packed up. Hayes had already begun gathering his things, but before Daniel could leave, the professor called out to him. "Mr. Thompson, Hayes said, his voice steady but not unkind. "I'd like to speak with you for a moment." Daniel's heart skipped a beat as he approached Hayes's desk. What now? Was this a good thing, or was it more criticism? "You've been making some noticeable improvements recently," Hayes said, looking up from his notes. "Your participation today was a good example of that. Keep it up. I expect to see even more from you in the future." For a moment, Daniel just stood there, stunned. He had expected Hayes to reprimand him or give him a lecture, but instead, there was something almost like encouragement. "Thank you, Professor," Daniel said quietly, feeling a wave of gratitude and disbelief wash over him. Hayes gave a curt nod, his gaze intense. "You've got the potential to do more than just get by, Mr. Thompson. Don't waste it." As Daniel left the classroom, a small, but significant shift occurred within him. The doubt that had clouded his mind began to lift. It wasn't just about fighting to fit in anymore. It was about believing in himself, even when it felt impossible. Hayes had seen something in him, and maybe, just maybe, it was time for Daniel to see it in himself. The weeks following the conversation with Professor Hayes felt like a turning point for Daniel. What had once seemed like an insurmountable challenge now felt like a climb he could actually conquer. With every passing day, his confidence grew, and his fear of failure seemed a little less powerful. Despite this, he knew better than to let his guard down. Harvard was a place where competition ran deep, where excellence was the expectation, not the exception. Every class, every lecture, every assignment, it was all part of the test, and Daniel was determined to pass. He had proven something to himself, but now it was time to prove it to everyone else. Still, a part of him couldn't shake the pressure. It wasn't just the academic workload that weighed on him. It was the uncertainty of what his future held, the nagging question of whether he could really make it here. And, if he was honest, the tension between him and the other students was starting to feel more palpable. There was an unspoken divide between him and most of his classmates, a divide that no matter how much he excelled, he couldn't quite bridge. One particular day, after finishing a lengthy exam for his history class, Daniel was walking back to his dorm when he noticed a familiar group of students talking near the main quad. They were gathered around one of the tall, ivy-covered pillars, laughing as they shared a joke. As Daniel passed by, he overheard snippets of their conversation, mostly about the upcoming social event that the university was hosting. "So, who's going to the gala next week?" one of the girls asked, her voice bright with excitement. "I'm going, obviously. I can't wait to see who actually shows up this year," another girl replied with a slight giggle. The word stung more than Daniel expected. Who actually shows up? It was a casual comment, but in that moment, it felt like a reminder of all the ways in which he didn't quite fit in. It wasn't about being invited, it was about the unspoken rules of belonging. And in that moment, he felt like an outsider again. Caleb, who had been walking beside him, noticed the tension in Daniel's face. He slowed his pace, matching Daniel's stride. "You're not going to let that get to you, are you?" Daniel shook his head. "I don't know. It's just, sometimes it feels like no matter how hard I try, I'll always be on the outside looking in. Like I'm just here to fill a spot and not really part of things." Caleb stopped walking, his eyes locking with Daniel's. "You've been at Harvard for months now. You're not filling a spot. You've earned your place. And the people who matter, they'll see that. Trust me." Daniel didn't respond right away. He appreciated Caleb's words, he really did, but there was still that nagging feeling. It wasn't just about fitting in. It was about something deeper, about finding his identity here, at a place that wasn't built for people like him. But Caleb wasn't wrong. Daniel had earned his place, hadn't he? He had fought tooth and nail to get here, overcoming challenges that no one else had to face. And now, with his improved grades and growing sense of self, he had to believe that he was meant to be here. The question wasn't whether he belonged, it was about how he was going to make his mark. The next day in class, Daniel felt different. He walked into the lecture hall with his shoulders squared, his head held high. He wasn't just another student anymore. He was Daniel Thompson. And he was here to make an impact. Professor Hayes arrived shortly after, starting the lecture with a brief overview of the material. As always, the room was filled with the low hum of students flipping through pages, preparing for the discussion that would follow. But Daniel didn't feel the usual sense of anxiety creeping in. He was ready. He had something to prove, not to anyone else, but to himself. As the lecture progressed, Hayes asked a question to the class, one that was challenging and complex. Daniel's mind immediately started working, connecting ideas, thinking critically about the material. He raised his hand, and before he could second-guess himself, he spoke. The relationship between these two economic principles is crucial because it highlights the interdependency of. Daniel's voice trailed off for a moment, unsure if he was going too far off track. But he kept going. If we look at this from a historical perspective, it's clear that. Hayes stopped him with a raised hand. Mr. Thompson, I'll admit, I wasn't expecting you to make that connection. That's an interesting take. Daniel's heart raced, but he didn't let it show. Thank you, Professor. The room fell silent for a moment, the other students looking at Daniel as if they hadn't expected him to be the one to speak up. But Hayes didn't let the awkward pause last long. That's exactly the kind of insight I was hoping someone would bring up. Now, let's dig deeper into this idea. Daniel felt a rush of warmth at the recognition. It wasn't just about the fact that he had contributed to the conversation, it was the way Hayes had responded. The professor wasn't dismissing him. He wasn't treating him as someone who didn't belong in that room. For the first time, Daniel felt like he truly belonged. When the lecture ended, Caleb was waiting for him outside the door. Dude, that was amazing. You totally got Hayes' attention. Daniel laughed, shaking his head. I didn't expect him to actually respond like that. Why not? Caleb asked. You've been putting in the work, and it shows. You've got a perspective, man. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. As they walked out of the building, Daniel felt lighter than he had in a long time. It wasn't just about the class or the lecture. It was about the realization that he didn't need to try so hard to fit in. He was already making a mark. He was already different in a way that mattered. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone but himself. That evening, Daniel sat down in his dorm room to work on his next paper. As he reviewed his notes, something shifted in his mind. For the first time, he wasn't writing for validation or approval. He wasn't writing because he feared failure. He was writing because he had something to say. His voice mattered. And no one could take that away from him. The gala that Caleb had mentioned earlier came and went, and Daniel didn't go. He didn't need to. What mattered was the journey he was on, the quiet victories he was winning every day. The real success wasn't about the parties or the social events. It was about the progress he was making, about discovering who he was and what he was capable of. And as he sat there, writing into the night, Daniel realized something important. He wasn't just learning about economics or history. He was learning about himself. And that, he thought, was the most valuable lesson of all. The winter semester was quickly approaching its end, and Daniel could feel the weight of the upcoming finals pressing on him. The air had grown crisp, and Harvard's iconic campus had transformed into a blanket of snow-covered quads and pathways. There was an almost magical feel to the campus in winter. A sense of renewal, of things coming to a close and others beginning. Daniel had been studying relentlessly, determined to finish the semester strong. He felt more focused than ever. His grades had improved, his confidence had blossomed, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. But there was still a lingering anxiety, an uncertainty about how much further he could push himself before he reached his limit. It was on one of those long study nights, a few days before the final exams, that Daniel's world was once again shaken. He had just finished reviewing for his advanced economics class and was packing up his things when he noticed a figure approaching his usual study table in the library. It was Professor Hayes. For a brief moment, Daniel froze. Professor Hayes was a man of few words, and when he did speak, his words were always measured. The last few months had felt like a slow, steady unraveling of the tension that had existed between them. Hayes had never been particularly friendly, but there had been subtle signs that his attitude toward Daniel was changing. This meeting, however, was different. Daniel could feel it in the air. "Mr. Thompson," Hayes's voice was low but deliberate. "May I have a word?" Daniel stood up quickly, his heart beating a little faster than he expected. "Of course, Professor." The professor gestured for him to follow, and they moved to a quieter corner of the library, away from the other students who were immersed in their studies. Daniel's mind raced with questions. What could this be about? Was it about his grades? His performance in class? Or was it something more personal? Hayes stood still for a moment, his hands folded in front of him as he seemed to gather his thoughts. "I've been keeping an eye on your progress," Hayes began, his tone serious. "And I'll admit, I didn't expect this from you. You've exceeded my expectations." Daniel felt a strange mix of pride and unease. "Thank you, Professor. I've been working really hard." "That's evident," Hayes said, his sharp eyes never leaving Daniel's face. "But there's something I need to ask you. And I'm not sure how to phrase this, so I'll just be blunt." Daniel nodded, trying to suppress the flutter of anxiety in his stomach. "You're doing well, better than I anticipated. But I want to know, why are you really here? Why Harvard?" Hayes asked, his voice now softer, almost as if he were asking a personal question, not just one based on academics. Daniel was taken aback by the question. "What do you mean? Why am I here?" "Because I want to learn, because this is the best place to grow in." Hayes raised a hand, cutting him off gently. "That's what I assumed. But it's more than that, isn't it?" Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't sure how to answer. He had never been asked such a direct question before. I guess I'm here because I want to prove something. To everyone else, but mostly to myself. I've worked so hard to get here, and sometimes I wonder if I'm really cut out for this. But every day, I tell myself I am. That I belong." Hayes studied him quietly for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, unexpectedly, his features softened. "Daniel," Hayes said, his voice almost unrecognizable, gentler, less of the stern professor, more of a man who had seen something in Daniel that he hadn't seen in anyone else. "I think you've underestimated yourself. You're here because you have the potential to do more than just survive this place. You have the potential to change it. And I don't say that lightly." Daniel's eyes widened in surprise. "Change it? What do you mean?" Hayes gave a slight, almost imperceptible smile. "I've been teaching here long enough to know when someone's truly capable of making a difference. You have a perspective, a hunger for knowledge, a drive to overcome obstacles that most students, hell, most people, don't have. And I don't want you to waste it." Daniel felt a lump form in his throat. He had always wondered if the professors at Harvard saw him for what he truly was, a student just as worthy of his place as anyone else. But now, hearing these words from Professor Hayes, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he had earned that place in ways he hadn't allowed himself to believe before. I don't know what to say," Daniel muttered, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't need to say anything," Hayes replied, his voice steady but warm. "Just keep going. You're on the right path." Daniel felt a weight lift off his shoulders, and for the first time in his life, he realized that he wasn't just living to prove others wrong or to fight against an invisible current. He was living for himself, and that, perhaps, was the most powerful realization of all. Before Daniel could respond, Hayes turned and began to walk back toward the main study area. "I'll see you at the exam," he called over his shoulder. Don't disappoint me." Daniel watched him leave, a sense of gratitude swelling in his chest. There was still so much ahead of him, so many obstacles to face, but in that moment, something had shifted within him. He didn't just belong here, he was meant to be here. As he sat back down at his table, the weight of his next exam no longer felt as suffocating. In fact, it felt manageable. He had come this far, and with this new sense of purpose, he knew he could push even further. Daniel had always known that success didn't come easily. But now, with the validation from someone like Professor Hayes, he understood that it was more than just the grades. It was about the journey, about who he was becoming along the way. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of study sessions and quiet contemplation. When Daniel finally left the library, the campus outside was blanketed in the soft glow of streetlights, the snow gently falling around him. For the first time in months, Daniel felt at peace with the idea of being in this place, surrounded by the weight of history and expectation. He wasn't just a student at Harvard anymore. He was part of something bigger. And as he walked back to his dorm, he realized that the real test had never been the exams or the grades, it had always been about believing in himself. The days leading up to the final exams were a blur. Daniel had immersed himself in his studies, poring over textbooks, writing notes, and reviewing old lectures with a relentless focus. But despite all his preparation, there was still the heavy weight of uncertainty pressing on him. The stakes felt higher than ever before. This wasn't just any final, it was a culmination of everything he had worked for. His performance here could determine whether he truly belonged at Harvard or not. He could feel the familiar, nagging doubt creeping in, the voice that had always been there, telling him that maybe this was too much for him, that maybe he wasn't as capable as he had started to believe. The past few months had been a whirlwind of small victories and moments of doubt, and now, it all seemed to come down to these final exams. Would he succeed, or would he falter at the last hurdle? One evening, a few days before the exams, Daniel was sitting in the library when Caleb found him again. The familiar thud of Caleb's backpack hitting the table made Daniel look up from his notes. Caleb sat down across from him with a knowing grin. "You look like you haven't slept in days," Caleb said, his eyes scanning Daniel's face. "Are you okay?" Daniel didn't try to hide the exhaustion in his eyes. "I'm fine. Just trying to make sure I'm ready. This exam, it's everything." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "It's just a test, man." "Yeah, it's important, but it's not the end of the world. You've got this. You've been kicking ass all semester." Daniel smiled faintly. "I don't know. It feels different this time." Caleb leaned back in his chair, his expression softening. "I get it. But listen, if you've learned anything this semester, it's that you belong here. You're not some kid who stumbled in by accident. You've worked hard for this. And yeah, it might feel like everything's riding on this test, but remember, the test doesn't define you. It's just a moment. Your story doesn't end here." Daniel thought about those words, but a part of him still couldn't shake the feeling that the test was more than just a test. It wasn't only about the grades, it was about proving to everyone that he wasn't just a random student, a token student, a poor boy who'd somehow managed to find his way to Harvard. It was about proving to himself that he was worthy of being here. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Daniel thought back to everything that had led him to this point. He thought of his mother, who had always told him that he was destined for greatness, that no obstacle was too big to overcome. He thought about the struggles they had faced together, the hardships, the endless sacrifices. He remembered the countless times he had felt like giving up, but he hadn't. He had kept pushing forward. Every step, every challenge had made him stronger. And now, more than ever, he needed to trust that inner strength. The next morning, Daniel woke up early. He ate a quick breakfast and headed straight to the library, determined to make the most of his last day of preparation. The library was quiet at this early hour, and as he sat down at his usual table, the weight of the impending exam seemed less suffocating. There was still work to be done, but for the first time in a long while, Daniel felt a sense of calm. Just as he was about to open his textbook, someone sat down next to him. It was Professor Hayes. "Mr. Thompson," Hayes said, his tone surprisingly warm. "I hope I'm not interrupting your studying." Daniel looked up in surprise. "Professor Hayes, I didn't expect to see you here." "I thought I might check in on my best student," Hayes said with a faint smile. "You've been working hard, I see." Daniel chuckled nervously. "Trying to. I won't lie, I'm nervous about the exams." Hayes nodded thoughtfully. "That's natural. A bit of nervousness can sharpen the mind, make you more focused. But don't let it consume you. You've done the work, Daniel. You've proven to me, and to yourself, that you're more than capable of succeeding here. But remember, this is not about perfection. This is about understanding the process. It's not about getting everything right, it's about how you approach the challenge." Daniel absorbed his words, feeling a weight lift from his chest. "Thank you, Professor. That means a lot." Hayes gave a small nod. "I know you'll do well. And don't forget, we all have our own challenges. What matters is how we face them." With that, the professor stood up and walked away, leaving Daniel alone in the library once more. But now, instead of feeling overwhelmed, Daniel felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't about a single test, it was about his journey, his growth. The exams were just a moment in time. It was how he dealt with the pressure, how he carried the lessons of the past months with him, that would determine his true success. As the day passed, Daniel studied with a clarity he hadn't felt before. He focused not on the fear of failure, but on the joy of learning, the thrill of challenging himself. He knew there would be obstacles ahead, but he also knew that he had the tools to face them. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of intense studying and occasional moments of calm. Then, the day of the exams arrived. Daniel sat in the large exam hall, surrounded by hundreds of other students. The room was eerily quiet, the only sounds the rustling of papers and the faint scratching of pens on paper. Daniel's heart raced, but he didn't let it show. He took a deep breath, reminding himself of all the hard work he had put in. He had come this far, and he wasn't going to let fear stop him now. The first exam was intense, but Daniel found himself navigating it with confidence. His mind worked quickly, recalling the information he had studied for weeks. There were moments when doubt crept in, when he wondered if he was missing something, if he had overlooked a key detail, but he pushed those thoughts aside and kept moving forward. Every question felt like a test not just of knowledge, but of character, of who he was becoming and how far he had come. The second exam was equally challenging, but Daniel felt the same calm determination. He had prepared for this. He had earned this. When the exams were finally over, Daniel walked out of the exam hall with a sense of relief. It wasn't that he was certain he had aced every question, it was the feeling that he had done his best, that he had faced the challenge with everything he had. That, to him, was the true measure of success. As he walked across campus, the snow beginning to fall gently around him, Daniel felt a deep sense of satisfaction. No matter the outcome of these exams, he had already succeeded. He had proven to himself that he belonged at Harvard. And no one, not even himself, could take that away from him. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The days after the final exams passed in a blur. With the last exam behind him, Daniel had no choice but to let go of the weight that had been building for months. The relentless studying, the constant pressure, the self-doubt, everything suddenly seemed so distant. As he walked through the sprawling Harvard campus, the winter sun shining weakly through the clouds, Daniel couldn't help but breathe a little easier. The silence in his dorm room that night felt almost too loud. His textbooks, once his constant companions, now sat abandoned on his desk. His mind, once a whirlwind of formulas, dates, and theories, now had space to rest. For the first time in months, Daniel allowed himself to simply exist. He closed his eyes and let the stillness wash over him, allowing his mind to settle. But, as with all good things, it didn't last long. The morning after the final exams, as he was leaving the cafeteria after breakfast, Daniel saw a familiar face approaching, Professor Hayes. His heart gave an involuntary leap at the sight of the older man. "Mr. Thompson," Hayes called, his voice warm but with a hint of urgency. Daniel stopped, looking up. "Professor Hayes. Is everything okay?" Hayes nodded, his expression unreadable. "Can we talk for a moment? In private?" A flicker of anxiety shot through Daniel, but he quickly masked it with a polite smile. "Of course." They walked together in silence toward one of the quiet outdoor benches nestled between the trees. The snow had stopped falling, and the ground was covered with a fine layer of white, glistening in the early morning light. The world seemed to stand still for a moment. Hayes sat down first and motioned for Daniel to join him. When he did, the professor looked at him seriously, his brow furrowed. "I've been thinking about you, Daniel," Hayes said, his voice tinged with a hint of something Daniel couldn't quite place, concern, maybe. "About your progress. Your development here at Harvard." Daniel shifted slightly in his seat, unsure where this conversation was headed. "I hope I've met your expectations, Professor." Hayes gave a small smile. "You've done more than meet them. You've far surpassed what I could have imagined when you first arrived here. Your dedication and growth have been nothing short of remarkable." Daniel felt a warmth spread through him. The validation from Hayes meant more to him than he had anticipated. Yet, the professor's expression remained serious, and Daniel could sense that something else was on the horizon. "But there's something I need to discuss with you," Hayes continued, his voice now more measured. "It's about the results of your exams." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. His thoughts immediately raced to the worst-case scenario. Had he failed? Was there something wrong with his papers? He couldn't fathom it. He had studied tirelessly. He had given everything he had. But this was Harvard, and everything here was different. Professor Hayes watched him for a moment, as though trying to gauge his reaction. "I've spoken with a few of my colleagues," he said carefully, "and we've had a discussion about your performance. I'll be honest, Daniel, your results on the final exams were exceptional. You're not just passing here, you're excelling." A wave of relief washed over Daniel, though it was quickly replaced by confusion. That's great to hear, but, is there a problem? Is something wrong?" Hayes paused before answering. "Not at all. There's nothing wrong. Quite the opposite, actually. You've proven yourself in every way. But we've been discussing your potential, not just in terms of grades, but in the broader context of your future here at Harvard. The question is, Daniel, where do you want to go from here?" Daniel blinked, unsure of how to respond. I don't understand, Professor. I just want to keep learning. Keep getting better." Hayes nodded thoughtfully, his gaze turning distant, as though contemplating something deeply. "And that's exactly the problem, Daniel. You're here, at the top of your game, but I wonder if you've truly grasped the significance of what you've achieved. Harvard is a place where you can change the world, Daniel. And I'm not saying that lightly. What I'm saying is, you've proven yourself capable of making an impact far beyond these walls." Daniel's pulse quickened, a strange mixture of excitement and fear stirring within him. "What are you saying, Professor?" "I'm saying that you've reached a crossroads," Hayes replied. "And the choices you make from here on out will shape not only your future but potentially the future of others." The words hit Daniel like a freight train. The weight of them settled in his chest, heavy and pressing. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected someone like Professor Hayes, who had been distant and unapproachable for so long, to suddenly open up and offer such profound advice. But Hayes wasn't finished yet. "Daniel," Hayes said, his tone dropping lower, almost as though he were entrusting Daniel with a secret. "I've spoken with a few other professors, and we've come to the conclusion that you could benefit from taking on more responsibility here at Harvard. We've been following your progress, and we believe you could be a candidate for something beyond just the usual academic path." Daniel felt a knot form in his throat. "What do you mean?" "We're offering you the chance to become a teaching assistant for some of the undergraduate classes," Hayes said. "And not just any classes, some of the more advanced ones. We believe you have the knowledge and the experience to help others learn and grow, just as you've done." Daniel was stunned into silence. He couldn't fathom it. A teaching assistant? At Harvard? For advanced classes? It seemed like something he could never have imagined for himself when he first set foot on campus. "Are you sure?" Daniel asked quietly. "I mean, this is Harvard. There are so many brilliant students here. I'm just me." Hayes's eyes softened. "That's exactly why we believe in you. You've done something most people can't even begin to comprehend. Against all odds, you've made it here. You've overcome everything, and now, you have the chance to share that experience with others." Daniel swallowed hard. He had always believed that his journey had been about proving something to the world. To the people who doubted him, to the ones who looked at him as if he didn't belong. But now, standing here with Professor Hayes, Daniel realized that maybe it wasn't just about proving something, it was about sharing his story, his experiences, and helping others who were just like him. Maybe that was his purpose all along. "Professor Hayes," Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything yet, Daniel," Hayes replied with a smile. "Take some time to think about it. But know that the opportunity is there." As they sat there in the quiet of the early morning, with the campus slowly coming to life around them, Daniel felt as though he had been handed a key to a door he hadn't even known existed. The future was no longer something to be feared, it was something to be embraced. And for the first time in his life, Daniel knew he was ready. The days following his conversation with Professor Hayes felt like a whirlwind for Daniel. His mind was racing, still processing the enormity of the opportunity Hayes had presented him with. A teaching assistant position. At Harvard. It was everything he had never imagined possible for himself. Daniel, who had once sat in lecture halls as the quiet outsider, was now being offered a chance to shape the experience of others. The weight of it both exhilarated and terrified him. As he walked across campus the following day, the snow that had blanketed the ground was beginning to melt, hinting at the arrival of spring. There was a sense of renewal in the air, a feeling that mirrored his own internal shift. He felt as though he had been handed something precious, something that could transform not just his future, but the lives of others as well. But with this opportunity came the pressure of responsibility, a pressure Daniel was still learning to manage. That afternoon, as he sat in his dorm room, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Caleb. "Hey man, how are you holding up after the exams? Want to grab a coffee later?" Daniel smiled at the message. Caleb had been a constant source of support throughout his time at Harvard, and the thought of spending time with his friend was exactly what he needed. "Yeah, I'm down. Let's meet at the cafe in 30. A few minutes later, Caleb was there, walking into the small campus cafe with his usual easy smile. He spotted Daniel right away and headed over to his table. "You look like you've got something on your mind," Caleb said, sitting down across from him, his eyes keenly observing. Daniel hesitated for a moment, trying to find the right words. He had told Caleb about the exams, about the struggles he'd faced, but he hadn't mentioned the opportunity Hayes had offered him yet. "Actually, there's something I've been thinking about," Daniel said slowly. "Professor Hayes. He offered me a teaching assistant position." Caleb's eyebrows shot up. "Wait, seriously? That's huge, man. Like, Harvard-level huge." Daniel nodded, his heart still racing at the thought. "Yeah. It's for some advanced classes, and it's a big responsibility. I'm not sure if I'm ready for it, to be honest." Caleb leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face. You've been ready for something like this your whole life. You've been working so hard, Daniel. This is just the next step. You've got the brains, the heart, and the grit to do this. Don't second-guess yourself now. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, clearly conflicted. I know, but, what if I mess up? What if I'm not good enough to help other students? It's not just about me anymore. It's about the people I'd be teaching. Dude, Caleb said, his voice calm but firm. You're here because you earned it. And more than that, you've been through so much to get here. Who better than you to help others see that they belong here too? You're not just a student anymore, Daniel. You're someone who can change lives. Daniel let out a breath, feeling a mixture of gratitude and fear. Caleb's words had a way of grounding him, reminding him of his worth. He had always struggled with the idea that he didn't belong, that somehow he was an outsider in a world that wasn't built for people like him. But as Caleb spoke, Daniel realized that this was his chance to prove, not just to others, but to himself, that he could not only survive here but thrive. I guess you're right, Daniel said, his voice quieter now, as if he were speaking more to himself than to Caleb. Maybe I am ready. Maybe it's time to stop doubting myself. Caleb grinned. Hell yeah, you are. You've got this, man. And I'll be here cheering you on every step of the way. The conversation left Daniel feeling lighter, more certain of his path. The decision to accept the teaching assistant role wasn't just about his academic career, it was about embracing who he had become. No longer was he the boy from the streets, struggling to make it in a world that seemed stacked against him. He was now someone who could help others, someone who had the power to give back, to share the lessons he had learned through his own trials. That evening, Daniel sat down in front of his laptop, composing an email to Professor Hayes. He hesitated for only a moment before typing out his response. Subject: Teaching Assistant Position Acceptance. Dear Professor Hayes, I hope this message finds you well. I wanted to thank you once again for offering me the teaching assistant position. After much thought and consideration, I am honored to accept the role. I am excited for the opportunity to contribute to the academic community here at Harvard, and I look forward to supporting my fellow students in any way I can. Thank you for believing in me. Sincerely, Daniel Thompson. The next few days passed quickly as Daniel prepared for his new role. He met with Hayes to discuss the specifics of his responsibilities, and to his surprise, he was given a great deal of freedom in how he would assist the professors and engage with the students. His role would involve leading study groups, reviewing assignments, and providing one-on-one tutoring to students who needed extra help. He would also have the opportunity to share his experiences with incoming freshmen, helping them navigate the same challenges he had faced just a year ago. The first day in his new role felt surreal. He walked into a lecture hall filled with eager students, most of them looking up to him as a peer, not realizing that he was once in their shoes, unsure, nervous, and feeling completely out of place. It was almost comical how quickly the tables had turned. As he stood before the group, preparing to lead his first study session, Daniel took a deep breath. This was his moment. He wasn't just here to study. He was here to teach, to lead, and to inspire. All right, Daniel said, his voice steady despite the flutter of nerves in his chest. Let's get started. The first few weeks were a blur of excitement and challenge. Daniel found himself working harder than ever before, balancing his own studies with the responsibilities of his new role. But something changed within him. He was no longer just a student, he was a mentor, a guide. His confidence grew as he helped his fellow students, watched them improve, and saw the impact he was making. One afternoon, as Daniel was reviewing an assignment for one of the undergraduates, he found a note tucked in the corner of the paper. It read, "Thanks for everything, Daniel. You've helped me more than you know. You make Harvard feel like it's possible for someone like me." The note brought a lump to his throat. He had never imagined that he could make such a difference in someone's life. But here, at Harvard, that was exactly what he was doing. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel realized that his journey wasn't just about overcoming his own obstacles, it was about helping others do the same. The weeks that followed Daniel's first session as a teaching assistant flew by, each day blending into the next. The campus felt different now. He wasn't just a student attending lectures and rushing between classes anymore, he was part of the intricate web of academic life at Harvard. Students now sought him out for guidance, just as he had once sought help from professors and peers when he first arrived. It was strange, humbling, and oddly gratifying to be on the other side of the desk. One afternoon, as Daniel was finishing up a review session for one of his courses, he found himself reflecting on the path that had brought him here. He had come so far, from a boy who had barely scraped through his high school years to a student trusted with teaching and guiding others at one of the most prestigious universities in the world. The pressure, once unbearable, had become a quiet companion in the background. He was learning to manage it, to navigate it. But despite his new sense of purpose, Daniel still felt like an outsider sometimes. There were moments when he caught himself doubting his place, moments when he overheard students discussing their lives in ways that felt completely alien to him, talking about vacation homes, summer internships in Europe, and their families' connections in high places. Daniel would listen to them, unsure of how to fit into their world. It was in these moments that he had to remind himself of the journey he had taken. He had earned every right to sit among them. One evening, after an exhausting study session that had gone later than expected, Daniel found himself walking across the quiet campus under a dimming sky. The air was crisp, the stars beginning to twinkle faintly overhead. He hadn't realized how late it was until he reached the main quad and saw the soft light spilling from the library windows. His phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking his thoughts. It was a text from Caleb. "Hey man, how's it going? You okay? You've been awfully quiet lately." Daniel smiled and typed back, "Just getting through it all. A lot of work, but it's good. I'll catch up with you soon." It wasn't that Daniel had been avoiding his friend. He just had a lot on his plate. Between his own studies and his work as a teaching assistant, his time was increasingly stretched thin. Caleb had noticed, and it meant something to Daniel that he cared enough to check in. He hit send and pocketed his phone, taking a deep breath. It was in moments like this that he felt the weight of the responsibility he had taken on. He wasn't just balancing his academic life, he was trying to balance his own identity, who he was becoming at Harvard, and who he had been before. Those two versions of himself often collided in unexpected ways. The next morning, Daniel was summoned to meet with Professor Hayes again. When he arrived at the professor's office, he noticed that Hayes seemed particularly serious, his usual warmth replaced by a more contemplative demeanor. "Good morning, Daniel. Please, have a seat," Hayes said, motioning toward the chair across from his desk. Daniel sat down, his mind immediately racing. Had something gone wrong? Had he overstepped somehow in his new role? "I wanted to check in with you," Hayes began, leaning forward slightly. "How are you feeling about the teaching assistant position? I know it's a lot to take on." Daniel paused, considering the question carefully. "It's definitely a challenge. Some days it feels overwhelming. But I think I'm doing okay. The students seem to be responding well, and I'm learning a lot, both from them and through my own work." Hayes nodded, a small smile flickering across his face. "Good. I'm glad to hear that. But I want to talk to you about something else. You're doing excellent work, Daniel, but I've noticed something in the way you interact with your students. There's a sincerity, an authenticity to your approach. It's not something I see in many of our more seasoned teaching assistants. They tend to rely more on the textbook answers, the formalities. But you, well, you connect with the students on a personal level." Daniel was quiet for a moment. He hadn't really thought about it that way. He had always felt a little out of place when it came to the formal academic world, so his instinct had always been to meet students where they were. "I just try to be real with them," Daniel said softly. I remember what it was like to feel lost, to feel like I didn't belong. I don't want anyone else to feel that way, not on my watch. Hayes studied him carefully, then leaned back in his chair. I'm glad to hear that, Daniel. Because I think it's something you should build on. You've got a gift, something beyond just being academically capable. You understand what it means to struggle, to push through the barriers that life throws at you. And that's exactly the kind of mindset we need more of here. Daniel's chest swelled with pride. It wasn't often that people outside of his inner circle acknowledged his strengths, let alone his struggles. Thank you, Professor. I just want to make a difference, you know. I know, Hayes replied, his voice softening. And I think you will. In fact, I have an idea I'd like to run by you. Daniel sat up, intrigued. What kind of idea? I've been thinking about how we could do more for our students who are underrepresented here at Harvard, Hayes said, his voice quiet but firm. There's a gap, you know. Students who come from backgrounds like yours, students who don't always have the same resources or support as others. We've got to make sure they have a chance to succeed, too. And I think you could be the person to lead that initiative. Daniel was stunned. The idea of leading such an initiative seemed impossible, especially for someone like him. But at the same time, it felt right. This was the chance to help others who were facing the same struggles he had. This could be his moment to not just succeed for himself, but to pave the way for others. I'm honored, Professor, Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. I'll do whatever I can to help. Hayes smiled, a look of approval in his eyes. I knew you'd say that. Let's discuss the details soon. But I'm confident that with your experience, your understanding of the challenges these students face, you'll be able to lead them in a way that no one else could. As Daniel left Hayes's office, his mind was reeling. Not only was he helping other students in his role as a teaching assistant, but now he was being given the opportunity to help create change at the institutional level. The ripple effect of his journey, of his struggles and triumphs, was spreading in ways he never thought possible. And for the first time, Daniel realized that his presence at Harvard wasn't a fluke. It was part of a bigger purpose. The weeks following his conversation with Professor Hayes were a blur for Daniel. As he settled into his new responsibilities, he couldn't help but feel a growing sense of excitement. The initiative Hayes had proposed, to help underrepresented students at Harvard, was more than just a project to Daniel. It felt like a calling, a way for him to give back and ensure that no one else had to struggle in silence like he had. It wasn't just about tutoring or academic help. It was about making sure that students who came from backgrounds like his had a voice, that they felt seen and heard, not just as students, but as people with stories, challenges, and dreams. Daniel's first step was to meet with the other teaching assistants who would be involved in the initiative. It was a diverse group, a mixture of graduate students, undergraduates, and a few faculty members who had expressed an interest in supporting the cause. They gathered in a small conference room in the student center, a space filled with a warm glow from the afternoon sun. Hayes was there to kick things off, his usual authoritative presence tempered by a quiet sense of excitement. Thank you all for being here, Hayes began, his voice steady but full of purpose. This initiative is going to make a significant impact, and Daniel will be leading the charge. He's going to share his vision with you today. Daniel, the floor is yours. Daniel felt his heart race as he stood up, his palms slightly damp. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment to speak up, to share what he had been thinking and dreaming about since Hayes first offered him this opportunity. Taking a deep breath, Daniel began. I want to start by saying that I know what it feels like to be overlooked. To feel like you don't belong. When I first came to Harvard, I thought it was a place meant for people with money, connections, and opportunities that I didn't have. I was the kid from the streets, and I didn't think someone like me had a place here. But over time, I learned that it wasn't about where you came from. It was about your determination, your willingness to push through, and your belief that you could make it. He paused for a moment, scanning the room, looking at the faces of the people who were about to help make his vision a reality. I want to create a space here at Harvard where students who feel like I did, isolated, lost, and out of place, can come together. We want to offer them more than just academic support. We want to offer them mentorship, a community where they can see people who look like them and understand their struggles. We want to make sure they know they are not alone, that they have the resources and the support to succeed. A murmur of agreement rippled through the group. We'll be offering weekly study groups, workshops on everything from time management to navigating the social aspects of Harvard, and most importantly, we'll provide a space where students can feel safe. We're not just helping them pass their classes, we're helping them build the confidence to succeed in all aspects of their lives here. Daniel's voice grew stronger as he spoke. The more he shared, the clearer his vision became. He had always known that the academic part of Harvard wasn't the only challenge, there were emotional, social, and financial struggles that many students faced. It was these challenges that, if not addressed, could derail even the most talented individuals. We're going to start small, Daniel continued, but we'll grow. And when we grow, we'll make sure every student who walks through these doors knows that this place, Harvard, belongs to them, too. The room fell silent as Daniel finished speaking. For a moment, he wasn't sure what to expect, whether the others would be on board or whether they'd see this as just another initiative doomed to fizzle out. But when he looked around, he saw the same fire in their eyes that had ignited within him. They believed in it. They believed in him. Hayes was the first to speak. Well said, Daniel. I can't think of a better person to lead this initiative. You've been through the struggle, and you understand the stakes. Now, it's time to make a real difference. Let's get to work. The room erupted into conversation, and soon the group was brainstorming ways to bring Daniel's vision to life. The energy was palpable, people were eager to be a part of something that was bigger than just grades and exams. This wasn't about academic achievement in the traditional sense, it was about giving students the tools they needed to thrive at Harvard and beyond. As the weeks went on, the initiative began to take shape. Daniel and his team organized their first workshop, Navigating Harvard, a guide to building confidence and community. They advertised it around campus, targeting students who might benefit the most from the extra support. The turnout exceeded expectations. Students from diverse backgrounds, many of them nervous or uncertain about their place at the university, filled the room. They were eager to learn from someone who had been in their shoes and could show them the way forward. Daniel spoke about his experiences, sharing the doubts and struggles he had faced when he first arrived at Harvard. He talked about how he had to learn to ask for help, how he had to fight against the feeling of being an outsider, and how he had found his place through persistence, courage, and community. The feedback from that first workshop was overwhelmingly positive. Students expressed gratitude for the opportunity to connect with others who shared similar challenges. Many of them said that they felt less isolated and more empowered to continue their studies with confidence. Daniel knew that this was only the beginning. As the initiative grew, so did Daniel's sense of purpose. The more he mentored and supported his peers, the more he realized that he was not just helping them succeed academically, he was helping them find their voice. He was helping them see that their worth wasn't defined by where they came from or what they had, but by their drive and determination to succeed. But despite the progress, there were still moments of doubt. Daniel found himself wrestling with his own insecurities. He had come so far, but the fear of failure never truly left him. Every day, he worried whether he was doing enough, whether he was living up to the expectations of those who had placed their faith in him. One evening, after a particularly challenging day, Daniel found himself in his dorm room, staring out the window at the campus below. The snow had started to fall again, the quiet flakes drifting down like tiny reminders of how far he had come. He ran a hand through his hair and sighed. Suddenly, his phone buzzed again, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was another message from Caleb. "How's everything going? You've been quiet lately. Need to catch up." Daniel smiled, his heart lifting. Caleb had always been there for him, through every high and every low. He quickly typed a response. "Yeah, let's grab a coffee tomorrow. I'll fill you in on everything. It's been crazy, but in a good way." He hit send, knowing that tomorrow, he'd be able to unload and share the excitement, and the doubts, that had been weighing on him. But for now, he was content. He had made a difference. And that was enough. The winter semester was quickly drawing to a close, and Daniel's life had become a whirlwind of classes, meetings, and workshops for the initiative. As the days grew shorter and the air colder, the pressure seemed to mount. The weight of leading the initiative, combined with his own academic responsibilities, felt like a heavy burden sometimes. But even in his moments of exhaustion, Daniel never doubted that he was on the right path. This was more than just about surviving Harvard, this was about changing the narrative for people like him, for students who had been told that success wasn't meant for them. He had seen firsthand how the initiative was making a difference. Students were showing up, engaging, and feeling supported in ways that many of them had never experienced before. The workshops were overflowing with eager faces, many of them sharing their own struggles, whether it was dealing with imposter syndrome, finding a sense of belonging, or balancing schoolwork with financial hardships. And for each student who left with a little more hope, Daniel's heart swelled. But there were also challenges. Not every student had the same level of engagement. Some were reluctant to open up, to trust in the community Daniel and his team had worked so hard to build. And there were those who didn't think they needed help at all, dismissing the initiative as something that wasn't for them. One chilly afternoon, after a particularly difficult workshop on managing stress and mental health, Daniel found himself alone in his office, staring at his laptop. The session had been good, students had shared openly, and many left with a sense of relief. But there was one student, Rachel, who had been distant the entire time. She'd hardly spoken, and when the discussion about academic pressures turned personal, she had shut down completely, retreating to the back of the room. Daniel had tried to reach out after the session, but Rachel was already gone. He knew she was struggling, but she wasn't ready to talk. He couldn't help but feel a sense of guilt, as though he was somehow failing her. He ran a hand through his hair and sighed, leaning back in his chair. It was moments like this when the weight of responsibility really hit him. How could he help everyone? What if he missed someone who truly needed it? Just then, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Caleb, as usual. "You look stressed, my dude. Let's grab dinner tonight. I think you need it." Daniel smiled and typed back a quick reply. "I'm down. Meet at 7. He didn't know if he could put into words what was on his mind, but he always knew Caleb would listen. They'd had countless conversations about life, struggles, and the dreams they both shared, and Caleb had never once judged him. As the evening approached, Daniel walked to their usual diner near the campus. The neon lights flickered in the growing dark, casting a soft glow on the snow-covered streets. The diner was warm and welcoming, a contrast to the cold outside. Caleb was already there, sipping on a soda and scrolling through his phone. "Yo, how's it going?" Caleb greeted him with a grin, pulling out the chair across from him. "Good," Daniel replied, sliding into the seat. "Busy, but good. Just, trying to keep everything together." "I feel that," Caleb said, setting down his phone. "You've been all over the place lately. How's the initiative going?" Daniel paused, thinking about Rachel and the other students he had been trying to help. "It's going well. I mean, it's definitely making a difference. I see students showing up, participating, and it feels like we're actually helping them. But some days, I feel like I'm not doing enough. Like I'm missing something or someone." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "You mean Rachel? You've been quiet about her since the workshop." Daniel sighed, pushing his plate of fries aside. "Yeah. She's one of those students who's kind of withdrawn. She never really opens up, even when I know she's struggling. It's frustrating, because I want to help her, but she doesn't want it. Caleb nodded thoughtfully. I get it. You're putting all this effort into helping people, but it's hard when some people just aren't ready to be helped. But that doesn't mean you're failing them, Dan. Sometimes, people have to come to terms with things on their own. All you can do is offer the space, the support, and the encouragement. Daniel let out a deep breath. I know, but it's hard to watch. I see so many people who are scared to ask for help, and I know how that feels. I don't want anyone to fall through the cracks. I get it, man. But you can't save everyone. You're doing more than anyone else would. Trust me, just by offering this initiative, you're already making a huge difference, Caleb said, his voice steady but filled with sincerity. Daniel nodded, his chest tightening. It wasn't just about his vision anymore, it was personal. He wanted to change things for himself, but even more than that, he wanted to change things for everyone who felt like he had once felt. Alone. Outsider. Lost. So, what's next for you? Have you thought about how you want to expand this? Caleb asked, taking a sip of his drink. Daniel smiled, the familiar spark of determination returning to his eyes. Yeah, actually. I'm planning to partner with a few of the student organizations. We're going to host a big event, kind of like a community fair, but with a focus on underrepresented students. We'll have speakers, workshops, networking opportunities. I want to show people that we're not just here to survive. We're here to thrive. That sounds amazing, Caleb said, leaning back in his chair. You're really making waves, Dan. And I'm proud of you, man. I don't think anyone else could do what you're doing. Daniel's smile widened. Thanks, Caleb. That means a lot. They spent the rest of the evening catching up, laughing, and talking about everything under the sun. For the first time in a while, Daniel felt a weight lift off his shoulders. It wasn't that the problems had gone away, they hadn't. But Caleb's words had reminded him of the bigger picture. He wasn't alone in this. He had people who believed in him, and he had the strength to keep moving forward. When Daniel walked back to his dorm that night, the snow had started to fall harder. The campus was peaceful, almost magical in its quiet beauty. He paused for a moment, watching the flakes drift down from the sky. He felt the weight of his purpose settle in his chest. The journey was long, and there would be many more challenges to come. But he was ready. He had to be. Because, for all the students who still didn't know how to ask for help, for those who felt lost in the shadows, Daniel knew that he was going to fight to make sure they knew they were never alone. Not on his watch. The weeks leading up to the big event were filled with anticipation and stress. Daniel spent every free moment organizing, planning, and coordinating with various student organizations. The event was going to be the largest of its kind, an opportunity for underrepresented students at Harvard to come together, share experiences, and connect with mentors who understood their unique challenges. It was more than just a fair, it was an emblem of his belief that Harvard could be a place where everyone could thrive, regardless of their background. Despite all the work he had put in, doubt still gnawed at him. What if the turnout wasn't what they expected? What if, after all of this effort, the students didn't feel the sense of community Daniel had envisioned? He had been in their shoes, and the weight of wanting to make them feel heard and supported was overwhelming. One afternoon, Daniel sat in his office, reviewing the event schedule for the umpteenth time. His laptop screen was full of tabs, logistics, speaker schedules, promotional material. He rubbed his eyes, feeling the strain of too many late nights. His phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a message from Rachel. Can we talk? I'm not sure about tomorrow. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. Rachel. He hadn't heard from her since that first workshop. She had attended a few more sessions after that, but had always been quiet, keeping to herself. He quickly typed a response. Of course. Let's meet up later today. How about 4 p.m.? Rachel didn't reply immediately, but Daniel's mind was already racing. What could she possibly want to talk about? Was it about the event? Was she finally opening up? He couldn't help but feel a sense of urgency. He needed to understand what had been going on with her. At 4 p.m., Daniel met Rachel in the quiet corner of the student center. She sat at a table by the window, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She was wearing a hoodie, the hood pulled up to shield her face from the world. "Hey," Daniel greeted her softly, pulling out a chair and sitting across from her. "Thanks for meeting me. What's on your mind?" Rachel hesitated for a moment, her fingers tapping nervously on the edge of her coffee cup. "I don't know if I can go to the event tomorrow," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel frowned. This wasn't what he expected. "Why not? You're one of the people this is meant for. You should be there." Rachel shook her head, her eyes cast down. "I don't know if I belong there. I've been thinking a lot, and I realized that maybe I'm not like the other students. I don't think I'm cut out for this whole community thing." Daniel felt a sharp pang in his chest. He had seen this before, the self-doubt, the feeling of being an outsider. He knew exactly what she was feeling. "Rachel, I get it. Believe me, I do," Daniel said, his voice gentle. "I was you once. I felt like I didn't belong, like I was just pretending to be someone I wasn't. But that's not true. You do belong here, and you belong at this event. We need your voice, your experiences. You're part of this community." Rachel's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but she quickly blinked them away. "It's not just that," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I feel like everyone here has it together. They know what they're doing. And I don't. I'm scared that if I show up, I'll just look like a mess." Daniel reached across the table, placing his hand gently over hers. "Rachel, you don't have to have it all together. No one does. That's the whole point of this. We're all here to help each other. It's okay to be vulnerable, to admit that we don't have all the answers. That's how we grow. That's how we create real community." Rachel looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign that he might be lying. But she found none. "I'm not going to tell you it's easy," Daniel continued. "But I will tell you that it's worth it. There's a whole group of people who are waiting for you to show up, not because they expect you to be perfect, but because they want to hear your story. You're not alone, Rachel. You don't have to be." She exhaled slowly, her shoulders loosening a little as she nodded. "I'll think about it." "I'm not asking you to make a decision right now," Daniel said, offering her a reassuring smile. "Just know that you have a place. You matter." Rachel's eyes softened. "Thank you, Daniel," she whispered. "Maybe I'll come." Daniel watched her leave, feeling a small sense of accomplishment. He didn't know if Rachel would come to the event, but at least he had helped her take a step toward feeling like she belonged. That was something, at least. The day of the event finally arrived. The team had set up booths, arranged speakers, and organized everything down to the smallest detail. The student center was buzzing with energy, the atmosphere electric with the anticipation of what was to come. As the event kicked off, Daniel stood near the entrance, greeting the students who filtered in. There were nervous smiles, hesitant glances, but most importantly, there was a sense of hope. This was more than just a day for academic resources, it was a day for community, for connection, for acknowledging that everyone's journey at Harvard was different, but they didn't have to walk it alone. By noon, the event had exceeded Daniel's expectations. The workshops were packed, students were networking, and most importantly, they were sharing their stories. There was laughter, vulnerability, and a sense of solidarity in the air. As Daniel walked from one booth to another, checking in with his team, he caught a glimpse of Rachel standing near a group of students, talking to one of the mentors. She was smiling. Laughing. It was the first time Daniel had seen her truly relaxed, not hiding behind the walls she had built around herself. She had shown up, and that was enough. But as he moved through the crowd, talking to more students and checking on the event's flow, Daniel felt a pang in his chest. There was one thing he hadn't expected: the shadows. The whispers. The looks from some of the more privileged students who passed by, noticing the event but not participating. It was subtle, just a raised eyebrow, a glance of judgment, but it didn't escape Daniel's notice. He had known this would happen. The old world of exclusivity was still alive and well at Harvard, and no amount of community building could erase the deep-seated divisions. He couldn't change that overnight. But he wasn't going to stop. He couldn't. As the event wound down, Daniel sat on a bench outside the student center, taking a moment to reflect. The event had been a success, beyond anything he had expected. The students had shown up. They had engaged. They had opened up. But he couldn't ignore the deeper reality. There was still so much to be done. This event was only the beginning. As he stared at the snow falling gently over the campus, Daniel made a silent promise to himself. He wasn't going to stop fighting for these students. He wasn't going to let them slip through the cracks. Not now, not ever. The week after the event was a blur. Despite the exhaustion from the enormous task of organizing the community fair, Daniel felt a renewed sense of purpose. His confidence had grown as he watched his peers come together, supporting one another in ways he had only dreamed of when he first arrived at Harvard. The event had been a powerful catalyst for change, even if just for a day. But it was what happened in the aftermath that truly tested Daniel's resolve. It started with an email, a simple one at first. A formal invitation to a private meeting with the Harvard administration. Daniel's heart sank when he saw the subject line. It had been a few weeks since his event, and he had hoped the powers that be would be supportive of the work he was doing. But deep down, he had always known that the higher-ups would take notice. And not always for the right reasons. He stared at the email for a long moment, debating whether he should open it right away or put it off for a while. But curiosity won, and he clicked on the message. It was signed by Dean Carter, a prominent figure in the university's administration, whose name carried a lot of weight in academic circles. Dear Mr. Daniel Mitchell, the email began. We would like to schedule a meeting with you regarding your recent student initiative. Please make yourself available at your earliest convenience. We have several concerns we would like to discuss. The meeting will take place at 10:00 a.m., Friday, in my office. Please confirm your attendance. Daniel's stomach dropped. The word, concerns, echoed in his mind. What did they want to discuss? Was it about the event? About the students he had been helping? Or was it something entirely different? He had no idea, but he knew one thing for sure: this wasn't going to be an ordinary conversation. Friday morning arrived with a heavy sense of dread hanging over Daniel as he walked across the campus toward the administration building. The air was crisp and sharp, the kind of cold that made his breath visible, but it wasn't the weather that was making his chest tighten. It was the unknown. He had spent the night before rehearsing what he might say, thinking about the ways he could defend the initiative he had worked so hard to build. His thoughts bounced between anxiety and determination. He wasn't about to let them shut down something that had the potential to help so many students. But as he stepped into the administration building and walked past the polished marble floors and imposing pillars, he couldn't shake the feeling that this place, the place he was trying to change, was a fortress, and he was about to be called in for a reckoning. At exactly 10 a.m., Daniel knocked on the door to Dean Carter's office. "Come in," a deep voice called from inside. Daniel pushed the door open, stepping into the room. Dean Carter, a man in his late 50s with a sharp suit and a more formidable presence, was sitting behind a large, mahogany desk. He looked up from his papers as Daniel entered and gestured for him to take a seat. "Mr. Mitchell, thank you for joining me today," Dean Carter said, his voice smooth but stern. "Please, sit." Daniel sat down, the silence between them stretching long before either spoke. He could feel the weight of the moment, the tension building. His palms were sweaty, but he forced himself to sit straight and maintain his composure. "I've been reviewing your initiative," Dean Carter began, his tone neutral. "And I have to admit, it's impressive in some ways. You've done something that I'm sure many of your peers are grateful for. Bringing students together to support each other. Well, it's a noble cause." Daniel nodded, his heart still pounding in his chest. "Thank you. That's exactly what I wanted to do, create a space where underrepresented students can feel supported and know they aren't alone." "I understand that, Mr. Mitchell," Dean Carter replied, his eyes narrowing slightly. "But there are some concerns we need to address. Concerns that I'm afraid might undermine the entire initiative, regardless of the good you think it's doing." Daniel's chest tightened. He leaned forward, trying to keep his voice steady. "What kind of concerns?" Dean Carter's gaze never wavered. "For one, the nature of the event itself. We've had reports from faculty members that your initiative may be encouraging divisiveness on campus. Your workshops and focus on underrepresented students, some of your peers have expressed concerns that this creates a sense of separation rather than unity. That it fosters an us versus them mentality." Daniel felt a wave of disbelief wash over him. He opened his mouth to speak but stopped, realizing he needed to choose his words carefully. "Dean Carter, that's not what we're doing at all," Daniel replied, his voice firm. "The initiative is about bringing people together, but it's acknowledging the fact that underrepresented students face unique challenges. We can't ignore those challenges and expect everything to just work itself out. We're not saying we're better or different than others, we're just giving students the resources and support they need to thrive." Dean Carter leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "I understand your perspective. But there's another issue we need to address. Your event received funding from a number of outside organizations, groups that have not been vetted by the university. We cannot have outside groups influencing what happens here without proper oversight. We need to ensure that these organizations are aligned with the university's values." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. The outside funding he had received had been crucial to making the event a success. But he hadn't expected it to be a point of contention. "I didn't invite any groups to influence the event," Daniel said, trying to remain calm. "The funding helped us provide food, speakers, and the materials for the workshops. It was all about providing resources for students. There's no hidden agenda." "I'm sure you believe that, Mr. Mitchell," Dean Carter said with a sigh. "But you must understand that there are procedures in place for a reason. We need to make sure that any event, especially one as large as yours, doesn't pose a risk to the institution's integrity. I'm afraid that without proper oversight, this initiative could become a liability." Daniel felt a lump form in his throat. He had worked so hard to get to this point, to build something that would make a difference, and now it felt like everything he had fought for was on the brink of being shut down. But he refused to back down. "This isn't about a liability, Dean Carter," Daniel said, his voice shaking but resolute. "This is about creating a space where students can thrive. Where they can feel like they belong. We need to address the real issues we're facing, not sweep them under the rug." Dean Carter stared at him for a long moment before responding. "I understand your passion, Mr. Mitchell. But I think you're being naive. The world is not as simple as you'd like to believe. I suggest you take some time to think about how you can make your initiative more aligned with Harvard's mission. Otherwise, we may have to reconsider your future here." As Daniel left Dean Carter's office, the weight of the conversation pressed heavily on his shoulders. His mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, each more frustrating than the last. He had always known that change wasn't easy, but the obstacles were starting to feel insurmountable. He had come this far, and now, it seemed like the very institution he was trying to change was pushing him back. But one thing was clear, he wasn't going to stop. Not now. Not ever. As he walked back across the campus, his determination hardened. He would find a way to make this work. No matter what it took. The next few days felt like a heavy fog had settled over Daniel's world. He couldn't escape the conversation with Dean Carter. Every time he tried to focus on his studies or plan his next steps, the words, liability, and oversight, echoed in his mind. It felt like he was walking on a tightrope, trying to balance his passion for his mission with the harsh reality of the institutional forces that threatened to pull him down. He spent long hours in his dorm room, reworking the plans for his initiative. What could he do to appease the administration without compromising the very essence of what he had built? Every option seemed to carry a cost. Either he would have to water down the core mission of the initiative or face the real possibility of having everything he had worked for dismantled. But then, as if a bolt of lightning struck, Daniel received a message that would change the course of everything. It was from Rachel. "I need to talk to you. It's important. Can we meet at 3 p.m. today?" Daniel didn't hesitate. He had been wondering about Rachel ever since the event, and now, it seemed, there was something urgent she needed to share. He quickly typed back his confirmation and made his way to their usual spot in the student center. At 3 p.m. sharp, Daniel found Rachel sitting by the large window, her posture stiff, as though she were bracing herself for something difficult. She hadn't been in touch much since the event, and Daniel couldn't help but wonder if the overwhelming emotions from that day had caught up with her. "Hey, Rachel," Daniel greeted, taking a seat across from her. "Hi," she replied, her voice softer than usual. "I've been thinking a lot, about the event, about everything. And I'm not sure what to do next. I feel like I don't have a choice anymore." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" "You're not alone in this, Rachel. Whatever it is, we'll figure it out." Rachel looked down at her hands, her fingers nervously twisting around each other. After a long silence, she finally met his gaze. "I've been getting messages from some of the other students. They're saying that the initiative is wrong. That it's creating division. That it's making things worse." Daniel felt a cold rush of anger ripple through him. He had known that there would be pushback from certain quarters, but to hear that students, his peers, were feeling alienated by his efforts, hurt more than he could put into words. "Who's been saying that?" Daniel asked, trying to stay calm. Rachel shook her head. "It's not just one person. It's like a group of students, some of the more privileged ones, I think. I've heard rumors that there are meetings happening, and some of them are working to get the administration to shut it all down. They think the event you organized is just another identity politics thing that doesn't belong at Harvard." Daniel took a deep breath, letting the wave of frustration wash over him before responding. "I knew this was coming. I've always known that people who don't see the problem wouldn't understand what we're doing. But that doesn't mean we stop. This initiative is important, Rachel. It's not just about us. It's about creating a space for everyone." Rachel's eyes welled up with tears. "I know, Daniel. I really do. But I don't know what to do. I don't want to be part of something that could get you into trouble. I've seen the emails from the administration. They're questioning everything, and I don't know if I can be a part of that anymore." Daniel felt a wave of guilt wash over him. Rachel had become so much more than just a participant in the initiative, she had become his ally, his friend. And now she was uncertain. "I didn't want to put you in this position," Daniel said softly. "I never thought it would get this complicated. But I'm not going to stop fighting for this. I can't. We've made so much progress, Rachel. There are people who need this space. I need you by my side. You're part of this, whether you realize it or not." Rachel's face softened, but her expression was filled with doubt. "I want to help, Daniel. I really do. But I don't know if I can risk everything for it. I'm scared." Daniel reached across the table and took her hand. "It's okay to be scared. I'm scared too. But we've got this far because we've kept pushing, even when we were afraid. You're not in this alone. And if you want to step back, I understand. But I believe in this. And I believe in you." There was a long pause, and for a moment, it felt like the weight of the world was between them. Rachel pulled her hand back slowly and wiped away a tear. "I don't want to leave you to do this alone," she whispered. "But I don't know what the right thing is anymore." Daniel sighed, his heart heavy with the knowledge that the road ahead wasn't just about fighting the administration, it was about holding on to the very people he was trying to help. It wasn't just about organizing events or building community, it was about navigating the emotional landscape of everyone involved, including himself. "I understand," Daniel said softly. "But remember, Rachel, we're not here to please everyone. We're here to make a difference. And if people don't get it, that's on them, not on us. You don't have to make any decisions today. Just know that whatever you choose, I've got your back." Rachel nodded slowly, her face still filled with uncertainty. "I need some time to think," she said, her voice quiet. "But I'll be here. For now." Daniel stood up, offering her a small smile. "Take all the time you need. Just know, we're in this together." As Daniel walked away from the student center, he couldn't shake the feeling of helplessness that had begun to settle in. The initiative was at a crossroads, and so was he. The threat of being silenced was real, and Rachel's wavering faith in the cause felt like a crack in the foundation he had worked so hard to build. He thought back to the conversations he had had with other students. To the moments when they had shared their stories and vulnerabilities. These were the moments that had fueled his mission. These were the moments that had given him the courage to keep pushing, even when he didn't feel strong enough. But now, it felt as if everything was on the line. Not just the initiative, but his sense of self, his purpose, and his commitment to making Harvard a more inclusive and supportive environment for every student. As he walked through the quiet campus, the weight of the decision before him felt heavier than ever. There was no turning back now. He had to make a choice, not just for himself, but for everyone who had believed in him, for every student who had shown up, for every voice that had been silenced for too long. The sun was setting on the campus of Harvard, casting a warm orange glow over the towering buildings. For Daniel, however, the beauty of the moment felt distant, almost irrelevant. He had never felt more conflicted in his entire life. Every step he took felt heavy, burdened by the weight of decisions that could change the course of his life and the future of the initiative he had poured so much into. The conversations with Dean Carter, the pressure from his peers, and now Rachel's uncertainty, all of it was converging into a single, overwhelming truth: something had to give. Daniel couldn't continue to operate in the shadows, trying to appease everyone. The time for compromise had passed. It was time for a final stand. But what exactly was he standing up for? The initiative, the students who had trusted him, or was it his own belief that things could be different? His thoughts were interrupted when he received a text from Rachel. "We need to talk. Can you meet me at 9 p.m. in the common room? I've made a decision." Daniel's heart raced. He wasn't sure what Rachel had decided, but he knew that tonight would be a turning point. He quickly texted back, confirming that he would be there. At exactly 9 p.m., Daniel walked into the common room, the dim lights casting long shadows across the floor. Rachel was already there, sitting at one of the tables, her fingers drumming nervously on the edge. When she looked up and saw him, her face was unreadable, her expression almost guarded. "Rachel," Daniel said, his voice tentative. "What's going on?" Rachel took a deep breath, clearly weighing her words before speaking. "I've been thinking a lot. About everything. About the administration, the initiative, and what we're really trying to do here." Daniel's stomach churned. He was afraid to hear what she was going to say next. He had seen the doubt in her eyes earlier, and now it felt like she was on the verge of making a decision that could tear them apart. "I want to be honest with you," Rachel continued, her voice quieter now. "I'm scared, Daniel. I'm scared of what might happen to you, to all of us, if this goes any further. But more than that, I realized something: I'm scared of what happens if we just stop now." Daniel's eyes widened in surprise. "What do you mean?" Rachel stood up and paced a few steps before turning to face him. I realize that this isn't just about me, or about you. It's about something bigger. We can't just back down because it's hard. If we do, we're giving up on all the students who need this. Who need what we're building here. Daniel could feel a knot in his chest loosen. Was this the answer he had been hoping for? Are you saying, he started, his voice trailing off. Rachel nodded, her eyes shining with a mixture of determination and vulnerability. I'm saying I'm in. All the way. I'm not going to sit back and let this get shut down. Whatever happens, we'll face it together. We're stronger than they think. Daniel let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. For the first time in days, he felt a spark of hope ignite inside him. He had fought so hard to get to this point, and now he wasn't alone. Rachel was with him, and that made all the difference. We'll face it together, he repeated, a smile breaking through the exhaustion on his face. Thank you. Rachel gave him a small smile in return. You've done so much already, Daniel. But now it's time for us to step up. We can't let them dictate what we stand for. This is bigger than Harvard. This is about the students who deserve better, who deserve to be seen and heard. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Daniel and Rachel, along with a few other trusted allies, gathered their resources and prepared for the final confrontation with the administration. They knew they couldn't take the university on directly without facing serious repercussions, but they also knew that there was power in numbers, and power in truth. Together, they began to mobilize. Daniel reached out to the students who had been part of the initiative, encouraging them to come forward and share their stories. They created a petition, a formal document that would serve as a powerful tool in their fight. The petition called for a more inclusive campus environment, one that recognized the struggles of underrepresented students and committed to real, lasting change. They knew it would be a long shot, but it was their shot. On the day of the petition's release, the tension on campus was palpable. Students gathered in small groups, whispering about what might happen next. Word had spread that Daniel and his allies were making their move, and it felt like the beginning of something big. As the clock struck noon, Daniel stood in front of a group of students on the steps of Harvard Yard, holding the petition in his hands. Rachel was beside him, her gaze steady and focused. This was it. The moment they had worked for. The moment they would fight for. Daniel cleared his throat, his voice echoing across the yard. This isn't just about one person. It's about all of us. It's about making sure that everyone who walks through these gates feels like they belong here. That their voice matters. That their struggles matter. We're not going to stop until we get the respect and the space we deserve. And if they want to shut us down, they'll have to answer to every student who stands with us. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. One by one, students began signing the petition, adding their names to the cause. The energy in the air was electric, and for the first time, Daniel felt like he wasn't fighting alone. Days passed, and the petition gained momentum. It wasn't just the underrepresented students who signed it, many of the students who had once been silent, who had once stood on the sidelines, began to step forward. They, too, saw the need for change. They, too, understood that the fight wasn't just about one group of people, it was about everyone. By the end of the week, the petition had garnered thousands of signatures. And it was clear that the administration had taken notice. Dean Carter called for a meeting with Daniel and Rachel, a final attempt to resolve the situation. But this time, Daniel wasn't afraid. He knew that they had the support of the student body behind them. They were no longer just a small group fighting for change, they were a movement. In that final meeting with Dean Carter, Daniel stood his ground. They negotiated, they compromised, but one thing remained clear: the university would have to make real, tangible changes to its policies. They agreed to create a task force dedicated to diversity and inclusion, with student representatives, including Daniel and Rachel, on the board. The victory wasn't perfect, and it wasn't everything Daniel had hoped for. But it was a start. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like they were headed in the right direction. As he walked across the campus, his heart lighter than it had been in weeks, Daniel couldn't help but smile. The road ahead was still uncertain, and there would be more battles to fight. But in that moment, he realized that the fight had been worth it. They had stood up for what was right, and they had made a difference. And for Daniel, that was all that mattered. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?